Thank you, Richard, and I'll add to your welcome. It's a privilege and an honour for me, actually, to be with you tonight and to chair this symposium. My role, really, tonight is to chair and to encourage the questions that I'm sure you're going to have after each and every one of our esteemed speakers. But I would like to just sort of kick off with a few sort of personal observations, historical reflections, that I hope will help set the scene for this evening's event. You may well have noticed from the invite that you responded to that this event is part of a series of events that fall under the banner of the Institute of Advanced Studies. This is an initiative within the university, a programme to really encourage interdisciplinary work, thinking and particularly international collaboration. So some of the funding that's enabled this event to happen tonight has been part of that programme. I'm just going to show you a short video to bring that a little bit more to life for you. So for me, it's very clear from that brief video that it is truly global in its reach and its ambition, this programme. And I think hopefully tonight we'll bring that very much to life in the context of the science of cycling. When Richard asked me to chair this session, it didn't need an awful lot of persuasion to say yes. Anything that combines cycling and science will pretty much get my attention. As I will come on perhaps to explain when I give you some personal reflections on my journey in both disciplines, and also to try and set some of the context for tonight. So we'll start with some pictures. Two photos from my life in cycling. The first on the left is me as a strapping 16-year-old. This is 1981. Apparently photography was only in black and white at the time. And for everybody under 50, those strange things on my feet are toe clips and straps. They're not just what you strap your bike on to your roof racks with. So pretty much 40 years spans those two images. I'm still cycling, I'm still enthusiastic, I'm still 74 kilograms, I'm pleased to say. That hasn't changed. I suspect I'm probably about 15% down in terms of whatever my true capacity is, and perhaps one of the things I might learn tonight is why that has dropped and what I might be able to do about it. But it's been a consistent theme throughout my life as a young person through into adulthood and then throughout my career. I've had a very lucky time, I guess, throughout my career. I fell into the sport of cycling by chance. If you were to see my school reports from pretty much when I started school up until 18, they were not dramatically impressive. But actually, it was a fascination for sport that led me to want to study it. And actually, that was the seed, in a sense, of my enthusiasm to actually become an academic, which I was for about 10 years in my early career. As some of you will know, if you've heard me speak before, it took me about 33 years to get my place at Loughborough, because I applied in 1981 to come here and study, and I think my grades were definitely not predicted to meet the minimum to even get an interview. So it took me another 3 years, and as a postgraduate, before I was able to register here for my higher degree. But in the intervening years between those two photographs, those two images, I've been fortunate enough to attend 7 Olympic Games as a coach, as a manager, and more recently as a strategist, I guess. I had a role for several years overseeing the investment in high-performance sport in the UK after I'd moved on from being a coach and a manager for British cycling. And I've been fortunate enough to see people emerge as promising young juniors over several years and become sometimes Olympic champions. So that process of development and maturation that leads to such extraordinary levels of success is, I guess, one of the endearing, fascinating questions for anybody interested in the science of human performance. What is limiting somebody, and what can you do about it? And when I reflected on tonight and some of the, I'm sure, fascinating insights we're going to get from our speakers, those questions remain not fully answered. And I suspect that, back to a very interesting sort of way of seeing science as an endless frontier, as it was once put in a report to the US government post the Second World War. We never really get there. We climb one mountain, we get to the top, we think we figured out what's going on, only to see another range of mountains ahead. And when I looked at the publication records and the areas of research of our speakers tonight, I suddenly realized we're still moving forward, we're still learning. Another reflection I have, I guess, is the extent to which, as Newton once said, we sort of stand on the shoulders of giants, the people that have gone before us, and the wisdom and the knowledge that they provided us with in order to understand better the world we sit in. And I'm going to mention a couple tonight. One you probably never heard about, but probably deserves more merit than has been due to date. So there's a character called Archibald Sharp, who in 1896 published a fascinating book entitled An Elementary Treatise on the Design and Construction of Bicycles and Tricycles. Anybody seen this? There's a few tentative hands up. I think I've already confirmed my hypothesis for tonight that this is a giant who is not well known amongst us. If you've got a few hours to kill and you are fascinated by the science of cycling, have a browse. It's pretty easy to find on the internet, as most things are these days. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary in a number of ways, I think, but not least the fact that actually a lot of things that still fascinate us now were fascinating people then. So I'll just show a few, probably not very readable slides. I've sliced from it. In fact, I'm certainly not expecting to read this. There's an image of a bicycle as part of one of the many chapters on the mechanics of cycling. And it shows what looks to me like a disc wheel and an open sort of disc wheel. Something which apparently hadn't existed before 1984. If you read one version of the history of cycling, there we are in the late 1800s, not just being imaged, but quantified and discussed and analysed as the potential for improving performance. Here we have one of those great power velocity curves. What are the determinants of speed of a bicycle? What are the components of drag, of friction? All worked out, all calculated, and unreadable to you, I know. But a table here looking at various methodologies for dragging bicycles across various terrain to decide what are the resistive factors. This is the 1890s, folks. And finally, to really labour the point, a force pedal, would you believe? Not only a force pedal in concept, but actually applied to generate a whole series of plots of the forces applied during actual cycling. This was the one that really blew me away for what it's worth. That we're still struggling to find ways of calibrating and making stable force measuring pedals today. And here's one attempt in the 1890s. And the bit I'd marked here was Actually, it's moved. It should be down a little bit lower. The first set of data here was actually the cyclograph as it was described being used on an old ordinary, a penny farthing, measuring the force output riding up a 1 in 10 slope. We've kind of been here before, I guess, is the message. It is extraordinary to look back and realise what was fascinating then and perhaps still is today. So we mustn't forget our past, but we must also look forward and see where things are heading. I think the other thing I want to say tonight before we move on to the speakers is what I hope is the significance of this evening. And that is a moment in time in the history of sport and sports science at Loughborough University. Many of you will know that in fact probably all of you know, we have an extraordinary reputation going back decades for both the study of sport and sports science and the practice of it. As of today, we have several semi-professional teams playing sport at the highest domestic level. We have a global reputation for research. In fact, we claim, I think quite rightly, to be the #1 ranked university for research in sport and exercise sciences. We have an extraordinary reputation in sport. But it's been a certain sort of bugbear of mine that we've never really had a profile in the sport of cycling that potentially we could, and I would argue should have. It's my hope that actually tonight is the start of a new chapter and a journey for sport at Loughborough, and one that can embrace more what we can do in and around the subject of cycling. It's a sport that probably offers more opportunity for investigation, science, and the application of that than any I can think of. In fact, there have been times when I've often wondered it was a sport sort of invented for scientific endeavour. It's something that can span virtually every faculty, every school that we have in our institution, whether that's performance sport, health implications, even social policy around transport, the environment, and obviously the manufacture and the development of the bicycle itself. We have aspects, we have strengths in so many different fields, but it's never really quite come together. So it's my hope that actually part of what we're achieving tonight is to start to put a little bit of a marker down for our intent to be more active in this space. We have 2 PhDs that are just about to be commissioned that are being industry sponsored by Wattbike, and I hope Richard, the CEO of Wattbike, has managed to join us tonight. I'm just scanning the audience. There he is. Excellent. Welcome, Richard. And many other potential areas of research and development. But it's my hope that at the very first stage, we simply are the sum of our parts, that all the various areas of activity that already happen here can be aligned in a slightly more strategic approach. And our last speaker tonight, Dave Nichols, is a great example of that sort of next step, somebody who's just been appointed our high-performance cycling manager, an alum, and somebody I'll be introducing in a bit more detail later on today. So my real hope is this is the start of a new chapter. But there's probably one other giant that really I should mention before introducing our first speaker tonight. And that's one that I'm pretty certain everybody in the room will know. And that is Professor Clyde Williams, who I hope is somewhere in the audience. And where is he hiding? My vision is going. Clyde, welcome. So I go right back in time to 1985 and my first visit to Loughborough University, and it was to a workshop run by Clyde for the then British Association of Sports Sciences. And I reflecting on that today, 2 things came to mind. A combination of, I think, intimidation of seeing just how high the bar was here, and inspiration as to what was possible to be as a young applied sports scientist. It was a very simple workshop about measurement and accuracy of blood-borne parameters, particularly lactate. But I came away with a different perspective on what good science looks like, and indeed that shaped, I think, a lot of what I then went on to do. So I'll thank you publicly for that, Clyde, and I'd love to take this opportunity to acknowledge just how significant your work has been in establishing not just sports science in the UK, but the reputation that Loughborough has around sports science. And it's my sincere hope that, as I say, tonight we're starting a slightly new chapter on how that works in cycling. And I'm also delighted to be able to recognise that you've finally arrived as a late recruit to the sport of cycling, I believe. So that's great to see. So, with those sort of opening thoughts in mind, I would really like to now invite our first speaker to come and present. David Bishop has an extraordinary profile in my mind. He's not just a world-leading academic in the area of exercise physiology, but he also has the experience of working in the applied world and supporting athletes at a high performance level. Those two insights to me always mean that you're going to hear not just where the cutting edge of science is, but also how it can actually apply in the real world. So David, would you like to come forward and...
Peter, fantastic introduction and some great insights there. Thanks to Richard, everyone here, Clyde in the room, so he's been thanked a few times, and it's really great to be here. And as mentioned, Loughborough is known around the world as the leader in sport and exercise science, no doubt, thanks to the leadership to people like Clyde over the years. So to come here has been great, and to be hosted here has been fantastic. So we're going to talk about, I've changed the title of the talk a little bit today. Let me just make sure we've got there. So, and I think as Peter mentioned, what I want to talk about is how we can apply the research we're doing, hopefully to help cyclists in particular tonight, but also others. I don't have a cycling background, but I think like a lot of us here, growing up, having dreams of being a elite athlete, dreams of not having my mum cut my hair as well, but I've managed to at least achieve that one. But I've always had, there's a passion for how to do, how to train and how to get the most out of our bodies, and didn't make it as an elite athlete. But so I guess I've taken that then into science, and the interest over the years, how do we apply what we're using in what we discover in the lab again to be able to help athletes to get the most out of training. And I really liked what some of the words that Peter said there, and I think they're really spot on, is that sometimes you get this almost competition between science and practice, and I think it doesn't work like that. Science doesn't have all the answers, and sometimes people see that as a weakness of science, that it doesn't have the answers, but we're never going to have the answers. And as long as, I think as Peter said, hopefully we're moving things forward and providing some insights. And sometimes what we're doing in science is just confirming what coaches have known for 30 years, and sometimes that's enough. But hopefully we're also providing some ideas to change some scientific practices. So with that, so that the goal of the talks, that's slightly different to one was on the flyer. So hopefully there's not false advertising there. Apologies for that. But so what I want to do is optimising endurance adaptations, and can some of the ideas that we are getting in the lab, can athletes and coaches use that to improve performance? And a lot of the work we do is based on skeletal muscle biopsy. So you're going to see some of the work that I talk about today is using insights from what we see when we do training studies and look at the muscle, and can we use those to give some ideas for research. This is going to be, I guess, my roadmap for most of the talk. So people are familiar with a guy called Stephen Searle, who's from Texas originally, but has spent most of his academic life in Norway. So he's come up with this sort of polarised approach to training, and there's lots of different ways. So in Australia, so I just wanted to point this out, is we tend to work off 5 or 6 training zones based around the first and the lactate threshold. Whereas you'll see a lot of and I think talking to some of the guys today in the UK and other places, and indeed Stephen's work is based more on a 3-zone model, but basically the same idea. With the polarised idea is that what Stephen Searle did was looked at the training programs of of a lot of elite athletes, specifically with rowers initially, but subsequently also with other athletes. And what he saw is that a lot of the training tended to be in this zone, maybe 70-80%, some up here, and tend to be why he's called it the polarised. It wasn't a lot in sort of this middle zone around about the lactate threshold. So I'm going to use this, as I said, as my, I guess, roadmap for today's presentation, and look at if there's any research, at least from the work we and others have done in the skeletal muscle, to support that idea, and also to suggest hopefully some other ideas as well. So I'll start here with the zone 1, and we've done research, and I won't do too much. Animals studies aren't always interesting for coaches, and we can get them to run, but it's pretty hard to get mice and rats to ride a bike, so it's probably even less interesting for people in the cycling community. But it's sometimes interesting just to see if the results match up. So we've done a little bit of work, and we've looked at you'll see this pop up quite a lot, and so citrate synthase is what we use as a marker of mitochondrial content. So everyone, I'm sure you all know, so the mitochondria are the energy powerhouses in your muscle that are producing the energy to allow you to keep turning the pedals. So we're interested in how the training affects these organelles. And so we've done a lot of work, and it doesn't matter if we look in animals or in humans, and what we find is that and most of these are cycling studies in the lab, is that there seems to be a good correlation between training volume and changes in this marker of mitochondrial content. So the greater the training volume, the greater the improvements that you get in the mitochondria. So I guess in some respects backing up the need for this high volume part of the polarised approach. Okay. And apologies, this is a running slide, but it was difficult. There's some in swimming, and I couldn't find anything in cycling, but this is Kipchoge's volume distribution during the 7 weeks prior to breaking the marathon record in Berlin. And so you can see that the total volume of training is obviously heavily weighted towards this polarised approach. So most of his training is very high volume, very low intensity for running the marathon. So I guess, both from the lab and what from elite athletes are doing is supporting the need for this high volume. So it's a brief overview, and there's other studies, but I think, both from a lab and from a field approach, I think that there's good evidence that a high training volume is necessary to get the most out of endurance. We've also looked at the intensity side of the spectrum, and I guess the opposite of what we showed you there. In this case, when we look at training intensity and changes in the number or the amount of mitochondria, we see absolutely no relationship. So training harder, doing very high intensity, doesn't seem to provide a strong stimulus. In the muscle, and the other is how capable the mitochondria that are there to use oxygen to produce energy. And in this case, we see when we start off at the lower intensity, as you go up, you can see this trend. So the higher the intensity seems to be important to get the functional improvements in the mitochondria. And again, we've compared different types of training. So here we've got moderate intensity in these white boxes, high intensity interval training, and then sprint interval training. And when we look at the mitochondrial function per mitochondria, what we see is only this very high intensity leads to the functional improvements in mitochondria. So again, there seems to be this polarised approach where the high volume is important for increasing the number of mitochondria, but the very high intensity is important for increasing the function of the mitochondria that are there. And again, if we go back to what athletes do, So I said before, lots of it high volume, and there's a little bit up here, so the track intervals and I guess the fartlet work, which is in this high intensity zone. And this study recently is quite a nice, I guess, practical example of this as well. So they compared this isn't from our group, but another group compared two different types of training. So they actually did a polarised approach where they had 80% in zone 1 and 20% in zone 3. Or they had what they called here was, I think they called it a threshold approach, where everything was below lactate threshold. So they've got 57% and 43% in zone 1s and 2. And then what they've got here is they did a time to fatigue at 95% of the peak power output. And as you can see, they got both groups improved, but there was a significantly greater improvement in their measure of endurance performance when they included this 20% of zone 3 training. So I think, again, from what the athletes are doing, but also what we're seeing in research studies, is doing some training in this, this zone 3, this high intensity, is important to get the most out of training. I want to spend a little bit of time on this bit, so the zone 2 more in the middle, and I guess there's some, depending on who coaches that you talk to, I know some that like to do a lot of threshold training, and others, which are including Stephen Sealer, I guess, recommend not doing a lot of training in this particular, around about the lactate threshold. And I remember, this was interesting, I was working with elite kayakers in Australia, and one time I was having a chat just with the coach, and she said, oh, lactic acid destroys mitochondria. I go, it's pretty cool, I didn't know that. And but what's interesting is, sometimes, and I mean this in a really positive way, is that sometimes coaches, and Peter maybe will back me up on this, but you're with the athletes every day, so sometimes coaches have some really interesting observations, even if they maybe don't connect, aren't connecting the science in exactly the right way. So she told me that, and I thought, she's working with Olympic athletes, she must know something. I did search on the internet, couldn't find anything, but we did some, oops, sorry about that. We did do some research, so we decided then, so we did a bunch of different studies giving acids and bases to athletes and trying to understand whether or not this acidity does have an effect. And so we've done studies this time where we're taking muscle biopsies immediately after exercise. Yep, you can volunteer. Straight after exercise, and looking at changes in pH and also changes in the muscle. And so this is one of the studies we did here, and quite often at least in research, you'll see this sort of acronym pop up, so PGC1 alpha, and it's just a marker of mitochondrial adaptation. So if you do a bout of exercise, we'll take a biopsy, and if we see that in the muscle, then that's an indication that mitochondrial adaptations have been activated by that particular exercise, and presumably if you get a greater increase, then you're getting a greater activation of the mitochondrial adaptations. And so we did this study here, and what we did is we had participants come in and do this high-intensity interval training session. So you can see there 10 by 2-minute intervals, 90% of VO2 max and 1 minute rest. And we got them to do it on 2 occasions. One time we just gave them a placebo, so that's just water, a neutral substance. And another time before they came in, we gave them a drink, we gave them a mild acid. And so the idea was to make their blood and their muscles mildly acidic while they did exercise, and see if that affected what we were seeing in the muscle. And so I think these results, they're quite interesting. So in the white is the placebo, and what we're getting is the normal increase in this marker of mitochondrial adaptation immediately after exercise. And when we gave them the acid, they're still getting it activated, but it got activated about half as much. So, you know, the coach is starting to look a little bit less crazy now that, you know, maybe something is happening there that if you're having your muscles too acidic, maybe it's going to affect some of your adaptations to training. And this is from a guy in Canada, Marty Gabala's group, and they did the opposite. So same sort of concept, except they gave a placebo or they gave some sodium bicarbonate before they did the exercise. So the opposite being, okay, your muscles are going to be acidic after exercise, but we'll give you some sodium bicarbonate so that they're less acidic after exercise. And when they did that, they saw there was a slightly greater increase in this marker of mitochondrial adaptations when they made the muscles less acidic. And this is probably the only other time I'll show you some animals, but we also tried to, that's interesting, that's just one bout of exercise. We also did it with training. So we did this study with mice, and just concentrate on here, but what we were looking at is the mitochondrial function in these mice. So we had the mice there, I don't know if you can see in the picture, but what we had is we had the mice training on the treadmill, so that, you know, they're training side by side. And before every single training session for 5 weeks, what we did is we had a small syringe, and we could put either water or we'd put sodium bicarbonate directly into their stomach so that they were doing their exercise with sodium bicarbonate in their system. And what we've got here in blue is after 5 weeks, the control group, so that's their value there for their mitochondrial function. After training, as you'd expect, you got about a 25% improvement in the mitochondrial function in the placebo group. And then in the bicarb group, who are doing exactly the same training, they're on the treadmill at exactly the same time, so, you know, there's no way they couldn't do any different training, they got almost twice the improvement in mitochondrial function. So by making the muscles less acidic during training, we're able to get a greater training response, at least in this particular study. We also done a similar study in humans, although this time they drank it themselves. We didn't have to put a syringe down them, which is nice for everybody. And what we did here is exactly the same thing. So the same concept is that this was a group of females training on the cycle, doing interval training for 8 weeks, doing exactly the same interval training. And the only difference was that we had one group that we gave them placebo before every training session, and the other group we gave them some sodium bicarbonate before every single training session. And here is their performance test, which was a time to fatigue. So at the beginning, we'd matched them so both groups were the same. The placebo group improved their time to fatigue after the 8 weeks of training, and the group that took sodium bicarbonate had an even greater improvement in their performance. Changes in VO2 peak were exactly the same. The bicarbonate group also had a significantly greater improvement in their lactate threshold. So again, it seemed to be that, you know, again, this is, you know, animals and now moderately trained females, but if we could make the muscles a little bit less acidic during training, then we could get greater improvements. This is again from the animal study. We've also seen some greater improvements in the ability to get lactate out of the muscles. I'll skip through these quickly. And normally this is, we did this study with the French Institute of Sport, so INSEP. So they're doing a classic cycle training, which seems to be popular over there, is that they do 30 seconds all out, 20 minutes rest, and then 30 seconds all out, which seems to be a common training protocol they use. And so we're doing the same thing, giving just a placebo before that training session, and we see a slight increase in what is this lactate transporter, which is in the muscle to help get lactate out of the muscle. When we give them bicarbonate before the same training session, we actually get a boost in that sort of protein. So it seems to be, you know, at least from some of our research, that on multiple levels, if you can, you're not going to completely stop it, but if you can maybe reduce mitigate the acidosis post-exercise, that maybe we can get more positive adaptations after exercise. Let me, I don't want to label this, I'll skip through this actually and get to the next bit. So what I want to say there is that, so I think, at least in my hands, I think there's some evidence, and I'm not saying don't ever do any training in zone 2 and that it's bad, but I think not, certainly I think from our research, certainly limiting the amount of training that's around about the lactate threshold, at least in my mind, I think that's probably a good strategy to get the most out of training. When we did these studies, I guess it was more for a scientific purpose. So when we used the bicarbonate or the acid, it was more as an experimental manipulation. But I have seen some, this wasn't necessarily why we did the study, but some have asked about using sodium bicarbonate during training, and I've spoken to some people in Netherlands and some other countries where rowers and other endurance athletes have done that. So there's not a lot of research on there, but that may be something that people may want to consider, that if you are going to do the high intensity training, whether trialing that to see whether that can be beneficial. So I spent the first half, I wanted to mostly concentrate on those sort of training variables about, distributing training in zone 1, zone 2 and 3. Obviously there's also the nutrition, so I just wanted to touch on some of the research that we and others have done there. So on top of that training distribution, can we manipulate nutrition to get better adaptations out of training? And I guess pretty popular at the moment is this idea of training low, so training with low muscle carbohydrate. So this is a pretty impressive review from Louise Burke and John Hawley, published in Science at the end of last year. But just going through this, I guess the theory that doing high intensity training sessions most likely with high glycogen, but having an argument for sometimes maybe not rushing to replace the muscle glycogen stores and doing some training sessions with low glycogen, and whether that can promote some of these adaptations, specifically in the mitochondria and also fat oxidation, which might lead to greater adaptations. And so I think that like most things in science, there's a little bit of conflict out there, but some of the early studies have supported this. So this is from Sweden, so Kent Salen's lab. Again, as I said, you'll see this pop up quite often, this marker of mitochondrial adaptation. And what they did an endurance training session with either normal glycogen or low glycogen. And you can see here, in both cases, there was an increase in this marker of mitochondrial adaptations. But and these are some pretty good cyclists, when they did the exercise with low muscle glycogen, there was an even greater stimulation of this particular pathway. So some support. One of the things, and I'll show you some of our research which goes against that in a second, but one of the interesting things is quite often these studies is what they do, the way they'll deplete the muscle glycogen is they'll do maybe a prolonged high intensity exercise in the morning and then wait a few hours and then do another exercise session. So it's hard to know from this that type of literature, is it because there's a low muscle glycogen, or is it because you're training twice in one day that's achieving that particular effect? So we did a study to try and tease that out, and so it's currently in review. And so just briefly, so basically what we did is we had the participants come in 3 times, and these are the muscle biopsies. They did high intensity exercise at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was 3 different conditions. One time is the control, so they've only come in and done that in the afternoon. They did the twice a day, where a couple of hours earlier they did a muscle glycogen depleting exercise, and then we didn't give them any carbohydrates here. And then they did a once day condition, where the evening before, they did that same muscle glycogen depleting exercise, and then they had the next day where we didn't give them any carbohydrates. So, as I said, the idea was in both of these instances, they're going to be exercising with low muscle glycogen, but here they would have done it twice by exercising twice in one day, and here they would have done it by exercising only once a day. And the paper's got lots of different results, but just just briefly. So again, we've got our PGC1 alpha. We've got the control group. Muscle glycogen didn't have much of an effect, but when we had them training twice in one day, we saw a massive effect on this marker of mitochondrial biogenesis. So at least with the high intensity exercise, a lot of what I think the so-called train low effect is actually coming from a training twice a day effect. And so that was a single bout. Then we also did a training study where we had people train for 3 weeks using the once a day approach, which basically meant they trained 6 days a week, and the twice a day where they trained 3 days a week but training twice a day. And the once a day, we didn't see any change in mitochondrial function, and when they trained twice a day, so it's still the same volume of training, we got around about a 20% improvement in the mitochondrial function. So exactly the same total volume of training, but the only difference is between training once a day and training twice a day. So I think if we go back to, as I said, I'll keep coming back to this. So I think we still need more research, but there is an argument for potentially, especially with the low intensity exercise, doing those in a low carbohydrate state. So whether it's having your hard session the day before or via nutrition manipulation. So I think with the low intensity zone 1, combining that with zone work has the potential to be a strategy to augment the adaptations. And potentially, and this is really hard training, there's also an argument, maybe, I don't think you want to do it all the time, but occasionally employing this sort of twice a day training approach where you have some sort of training in the morning, then a few hours later, topping on top of that, doing another training session or another high intensity training session. At least from our results, again, that can be a way to start putting all this together and going beyond, I guess, just the zone 1, zone 2, zone 3 periodisation, but also then combining different training sessions. We've also been interested in the use of cold water immersion and also recovery. So we've done a few studies there. This isn't from us, but we know that cold can activate some of these, activate the muscle as well. So there's been some studies looking at here where people did exercise and you get this small increase in PGC1 alpha. Or what they did is in here, the recovery after exercise, they get people to jump in a cold water bath for 10, 15, 20 minutes, depending on the protocol. And at least with some of these low intensity protocols, especially, you do see augmentation of the training stimulus. We've also looked at it with high intensity exercise, and so this is with sprint interval training, and the effect doesn't seem to be as great, but again, there's some indication that using the cold water immersion immediately after a high intensity session may help the athletes to get a better response to that particular training session. It seems to be much more powerful stimulus with low intensity exercise. And there's also, so Shona Halson, who was at the AIS at the study, also did a study using elite cyclists who are training at the Australian Institute of Sport. Didn't see a dramatic difference, but you can see here definitely a trend. So these groups, it was the squads, so they were all doing the same training session, cycling around Canberra for 4 weeks there, and they had one group who just recovered normally after every training session, and this group in black who did the cold water immersion immediately after each training session. So I think these differences weren't actually significant, but you can definitely see a trend there, especially after the taper, that even in the elite cyclists, there seemed to be a trend for cold water immersion helping out. So come back here, it starts to get a little bit more complicated. But so I think, there's an argument that potentially adding cold water immersion, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that it's going to negatively affect the training adaptation, and certainly some evidence of a small positive effect by incorporating some cold water immersion. This is similar to some of the work that Richard's been doing. So we've also been interested in the idea of, it's becoming quite popular, is this blood flow occlusion idea. So doing the exercise, but using a blood pressure cuff or whatever it might be to occlude their muscles during exercise. And I think people don't necessarily know the mechanisms, but some indication both with strength training and with endurance training that exercising with the muscle being occluded may be able to increase the adaptations. And so we've seen that as well. So you've got a control group who are doing exercise on the cycle, and we get the usual sort of small change in PGC1 alpha. When they did exactly the same exercise, but this was the ischemic condition we've called it, so with the blood flow occlusion, you can see that it's a much greater effect. So potentially, especially with lower intensity exercise, because anyone who's done this, you can't do very high intensity exercise when you're doing the occlusion, but so maybe with some of the zone 1 training, and probably obviously more likely on a cycloergometer or on the roller or something. But occasionally this may also be another strategy that can be incorporated into the training session to increase the training stimulus for the same training load. And so this is a single bout of exercise. Oops. We've just had a paper that'll be coming out in the next few weeks, I assume. But we also did a training study as well. So the response to a single bout of exercise is interesting. But again, when we did the blood flow restriction, we got a greater improvement in, this was the incremental peak power. So we're doing one-legged knee extensions, classic sort of Copenhagen research, but getting significantly greater improvements in this measure of endurance performance when they trained with the blood flow restriction compared to just doing the control. So again, sort of superimposing on that is, I probably shouldn't have drawn this much at this end, but definitely with the more sort of zone 1 type training, that may be another way to, I think as working with athletes, looking for a way to get some variety into training, but that may be a way on some training sessions to occasionally introduce some blood flow restriction to try and get even greater adaptations out of this zone 1 training. I wanted to, how are we going for time? Minutes. Yep, perfect. I just wanted to finish up with a couple of other observations. And I was talking to the guys and girls at Loughborough Sport this afternoon. So this is from one of my PhD students. Is if you're going through the literature or working with athletes or doing research, we've been talking about zone 1 and zone 2 and zone 3, and that relies on determining the lactate threshold. And these are all of the possible lactate thresholds that you can calculate depending on what you like. So you can see, so this ranging from 204 in this particular, so this is an actual athlete in our study, 243 watts up to 338 watts. So there's about 100 watts different depending on the lactate threshold. So if I'm telling you that, this is your zone 2 training here, or your zone 2 training is up here, then it's obviously a big difference. So I only put that in there not to confuse or anything, but just to say that the methodology is really important. So when if you're talking about the lactate threshold or you're talking about zone 1, 2, or 3, it's critical that you're comparing apples with apples, and if you're comparing studies or tests or whatever it might be, make sure you know what lactate threshold you're actually referring to. And so in this, anyone who's interested, Nick, my PhD student, did an awesome job with this paper, but we've made some recommendations on what we think is the best way to determine the lactate threshold if you're going to be using it for training. Okay, it's jumping around a bit, sorry. The other thing I wanted to point out as well is that quite often you'll see studies talking about training at a percentage of VO2 max, and that's also a little bit problematic because it also depends on the type of athlete and also the type of incremental protocol that you use to determine the peak power. So, depending on the athlete and the protocol, the lactate threshold could range from 50 to 90% of VO2 max. So, if you're looking at a paper sometime, or, could be two studies that say that they've done their training at 70% of VO2 max and they've got completely different results, it's probably because depending on the athlete or depending on how they determined it, you're going to get a completely different physiological stimulus. And so that then becomes important when you're designing training. So this is a really great paper from Ed Coyle back in '84, but he had a group of pretty good cyclists who had the same VO2 max, but had he grouped them into high lactate threshold and low lactate threshold. So you can see here, if you had told them to exercise at 70% of VO2 max, these guys here are going to be training somewhere in L2, L3 from our scheme, or level 5 if you're someone with a low lactate threshold. So there's obviously going to be that's a massive difference in the physiological stimulus. So at least in the work that I do with athletes and also the research, that's why I prefer using lactate thresholds to demarcate the different training zones rather than using a heart rate max or VO2 max. There we go. I like this I'll finish this, the last 3 slides I think, is it's a really nice paper. In some ways it's obvious, but it's also sometimes nice to see it in the research. But what this study did here is they looked at, again, this, everyone will know PGC1 alpha now, looked at this marker, and they had them do the same exercise a bunch of times. And you see this sort of sawtooth pattern. So the first time you do the exercise, it's a powerful stimulus to activate the mitochondria. And then each time you come back, you're getting a slightly slower stimulus. So, anyone who works with athletes knows about progressive overload and increasing the stimulus. But I think sometimes maybe we take it for granted. So this is a really nice demonstration that if you're not using progressive overload, you're going to get a smaller stimulus on the muscle each time. And we've done something similar, again looking at this but in a slightly different way. This is really interesting, I think. So this is our marker PGC1 alpha. When they came in, this is the increase of this protein in the nucleus. But anyway, you see it increase, quite markedly. Then we sent people away and trained them for 3 weeks, quite hard. And then we got them to come back and do exactly the same exercise, and absolutely nothing happened in terms of the stimulus for mitochondrial adaptation. So again, I think just another nice example of the need for the progressive overload and seeing it at the muscle level. If you're not increasing that exercise stimulus, then you're still going to get some adaptations, but you can definitely see a dampening of what's happening at the muscle. And I think it's also, this is important to point out as well, is that when we do training, we can get really, quite, especially if we're using moderately trained people, we can get pretty dramatic changes. Here we're looking at mitochondrial function with training, but as soon as you stop the training, basically, even within about 2 weeks, we're losing almost all of the mitochondrial adaptations that we were seeing by training. So I guess, just the importance of maintenance, and also, we don't have time to talk about tonight, but I guess in terms of getting the taper right, that if you're not careful, then you can very quickly lose a lot of these adaptations. So I'll finish here. In terms of, Seal also talks about what he's called here his hierarchy of endurance training needs. So I think it's a nice way to sort of close the circle. So I've sort of talked mostly about this. I think, it's pretty well established the volume of training and the need to do some high intensity training, and also trying to get this distribution right. So predominantly doing the high volume, but also making sure there's some high intensity. These, I think, he's got these at the bottom of the pyramid, because I think that's these are the key things. Sometimes it's become really popular to talk about the 1%ers, but we need to think about the 99%ers, because they're the ones that are going to get you the most. So I think it's really important to get this part right. You can start thinking about some of these. So I briefly sort of touched on the tapering, but definitely some sort of nutrition, cold water, blood flow restriction. You can start, once you've got this base right, then you can start thinking about potentially how do you go about using these to get that last couple of percent. To finish there, I want to thank, I presented a fair bit of data, hopefully not too much data there, sorry. But a lot of that gets done by my PhD students. I wanted to thank my family as well for letting me come over here, and a couple of days after I get back they'll start talking to me again. But, thank them, and thank you all as well. So hopefully it's given you a little bit of an idea, at least how I think some of the findings in the lab can give some ideas on how to modify training. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for that. If I have had any doubt before that I was too range of the mountains behind, I'm now absolutely certain. I was just waiting for altitude to be thrown into the mix to fully lose me. Folks, we were planning on having one or two brief questions after each presentation, but what I would encourage you to do actually is to write down the key questions you would have wanted to ask David, because we're actually going to have an open forum at the end with all four speakers and a Q&A. So I think what we'll do is we'll keep moving forward, keep to time. So thank you again for that fantastic presentation, and we'll come back to you with those probing questions at the close of the session. So I'd like to now introduce somebody you all know, Dr. Richard Ferguson. I think the best way to introduce Richard is he's had the kind of career I would have liked to have had if I hadn't drifted into coaching, I think, which would have been a great career as an academic. And probably, though sometimes it hurts, having taught hundreds, if not thousands, of students here, many of whom have gone through, completed their PhDs, and now working for national cycling federations and indeed professional teams too. So if that's not too brief an introduction, Richard, over to you, and to talk to us about, I think, optimising training levels. Yes, I think so.
That's great, Pete. Thanks very much for the introduction. You didn't put my picture up, thankfully.
I didn't.
I'll leave it off.
I'll get it in at the end.
You'll get it in at the end, yes. It's a picture of me breaking away from the peloton in the third, fourth Cap Carnage races around Leicestershire, and that's my one and only match. To use a sort of vague terminology, I burned my match, and it's a very short one. Or if we're going to talk about science, it's my W prime, lasts about 15 seconds. And then I resort to the usual position at the back of the peloton, mouthing off about holding your line and pointing out the potholes and so on. I'm very old school in that sense. Anyway, so my task, which I gave myself, which is quite a tough one to follow on from David, is to give you a bit of an appreciation of finding your zones and or what I'm going to call, from a physiological perspective, the domains of exercise. So the purpose of today's presentation is to introduce you to the concepts from a physiological perspective of exercise domains, and try and map them onto what I would probably call the commonly known zones. And I'm probably preaching to the converted here, because I'm sure you all use zones and so on. But I think if it's a question of giving you a little bit of clarity of where these zones perhaps came from and how we can resolve them a little bit more fundamentally, then hopefully that'll be a success. And then I also want to sort of give you a little description of how we can test those zones. David talked about lactate threshold and the procedures you need to do a lactate threshold test. But are there other alternatives that you might be able to use in the field that is more important, perhaps, for the take-home messages and the coaches and the athletes? I think what's important to do, first of all, is really to give a sort of, this is my main sort of physiological slide, is to understand the notion of integrative physiology of exercise, and that we are a whole body and there's lots of physiological systems. And this is a classic figure from 1978 or whenever it was, from Kalman Wasserman, one of the sort of great physiologists, respiratory physiologists. And exercise performance is clearly dependent upon the integrated function of all these systems and then working closely together and in unison. And in terms of endurance exercise performance, it's really all about getting oxygen from the atmosphere into our lungs, transported across through the alveoli into the red blood cells, through the circulation, pumped out through the heart around to the peripheral circulation, and then into the mitochondria for use in the electron transport chain. So it all depends upon this working quite nicely. Now, the important thing about endurance exercise is that we have set demands of those exercises, whether it's 200 watts or, if you're Chris Froome, 350 watts or whatever. And when those demands are met by the delivery of oxygen, we are in a so-called steady state. So we reach a steady state or a steady rate of exercise. Now, when those demands increase, the exercise intensity increases, the gradient goes up to 10, 12, 15%, then we can't meet those demands. The demands of the exercise can't be matched by the delivery of oxygen to the mitochondria. So we must rely on other physiological processes, typically the anaerobic processes that are used in, that don't need oxygen, so glycolysis, phosphocreatine utilization, and so on. So when we can't match this demand, these processes become more prominent, and that ultimately leads to what we call exercise intolerance or fatigue. Now, we could have a whole symposium on fatigue, without a doubt, and there's a good physiological society symposium in the next at the Aberdeen Physiological Society meeting solely dedicated to fatigue, and it's very complex. It's not just about skeletal muscle, the brain is involved, and that tees up Ian Taylor very nicely for his next presentation. So I'm aware of that, but broadly speaking, it's closely linked to the high reliance on anaerobic metabolic processes. So with that in the back of your mind in terms about steady state, what I want to try and do is introduce you to the zones and domains and what they are and how they are defined. And of course, there are many different versions, and I heard today that the Australian guys use a slightly different version to this system. They have a 5-zone system. This is a very common, I think it was developed by Andy Coggan from the famous training and competing with a power meter. And you can see we've got 7 zones there, ranging from active recovery, endurance, all based around FTP, this so-called functional threshold power, which I'll come on to a little bit later. Indeed, there's another zone somewhere around about here, maybe 3A, called the sweet spot. I mean, in my perspective, you should only use the word sweet spot when you are with your partner or your husband or your wife. Okay, so, that's my perspective from that, so I'll apologise in advance. But you see the sort of terminology that we're faced with here. But my contention is that, should we be using the domains concept? And the domains has been coined by a great respiratory physiologist, Brian Whipp, back in the early 80s and 90s, based upon some classic respiratory physiological work down in St George's in London. And I think what is really important is that these domains are based upon rigorous physiological concepts. So it's underpinned by rigorous physiology that is repeatable, it's valid, and you observe it every time you do these kind of this particular system and concept. But what we also need to do is try and define what delineates these domains, what separates the domains, what are the physiological principles that separates the domains or the zones. So let's try and address that first. And of course, David's given a nice sort of tee up in terms of the process of lactate threshold, or the principle of lactate threshold. So this is really the first delineator between the existing domains. And this is some data from a subject that's coming into our lab over the last sort of six months. And this is a typical lactate threshold curve. So we start at a relatively low intensity, increase the intensity over a sort of 3 or 4 minute steps, take a blood lactate sample from the ear, and continue until they sort of fatigue, perhaps, towards the end of exercise. And you get a classic curvilinear relationship like that. And I think David pointed out very nicely that as scientists, we don't help ourselves. We don't help ourselves in this, and that over the last 30 to 40 years, there are this many, if not more, definitions of lactate threshold. And that's causing a lot of confusion with scientists and coaches and athletes and so on. What is the lactate threshold that we should use to delineate the first domain? I'm going to stick my neck out here a little bit and sort of try and summarize it very simply, in that we're now sort of using a very simplistic term in terms of the first threshold. So what is the first threshold? Lactate turn point, lactate threshold 1, whatever you want to call it, is around this area. And again, depending on how you use it, depending on your protocol that you use to do your lactate threshold test, has a big impact on that. But broadly speaking, your sort of LT1 or your lactate turn point is around this sort of lower exercise intensity. And then broadly speaking, there is another threshold that is up at the higher intensities, which coincides with maximal lactate steady state and various other things. And we can, suffice to say, for today's purpose, define that as lactate threshold 2 or lactate threshold. And I'll contend a little bit later that that coincides with the so-called critical power concept. And I'll introduce you to that in a minute. So this is sort of our first lactate threshold. And again, how you define that specifically in your laboratory practicals or in your laboratory tests is still open for discussion. So lactate threshold, our first delineating threshold. The next threshold we would contend is defined as critical power, and this has been used for 30 to 40 years. It was quite, well, even earlier. It's been observed in all sorts of tissues, in isolated tissue, in all sorts of different events and sports. But it's becoming a very important threshold, or critical power or fatigue threshold, that is very important for exercise performance. To put it simply, it's a complicated mathematical function, but essentially what you do is to test for critical power, you have to perform a series of sort of constant load exercise tests at quite a high intensity, maybe between sort of 75 and 100% of your maximum aerobic power. And you perform these until you can't continue any longer. And you do them at various different exercise intensities. And then when you fit this characteristic curve, the asymptote, so the projection of this line, is equivalent to your critical power. So critical power is thought to reflect, or is relatively known to reflect, the highest constant power output that you can achieve without the progressive loss of homeostasis. So you can achieve a sort of steady state in terms of the physiological response to exercise, both in terms of VO2 and metabolic acidosis or lactate concentration. So this sort of next threshold. Of course, we are familiar with the term of VO2 max and maximal, perhaps maximal aerobic power. And this is the power output at which you achieve VO2 max. So this is our sort of next potential delineator. So we've got lactate threshold, critical power, and VO2 max. So if you were to do a very straightforward ramp test, increasing the exercise intensity fairly smoothly, or with sort of various steps, the intensity or the power output at which you achieve VO2 max, you can define as maximal aerobic power, or peak work rate, or maximum minute power. Again, different definitions, different terminology, broadly meaning the same thing. So they are essentially our three delineating functions. So what I want to try and do is provide a picture of how these fit together, and then to give you an understanding of what are the physiological responses to exercise within these domains, okay? Because that's what will delineate the nature of our zones. So this is our sort of power, our power axis. Don't worry about the x-axis here. That doesn't mean anything just now. So first, power output going up from 0 up to maximum sprint power output. Our first delineator is lactate threshold. The first lactate threshold, however you define that. 1 millimole above baseline or 0.4 millimole above baseline or whatever you want to do. So that's our first lactate threshold. Increase the intensity or increase the power output a little bit more, and then we hit our so-called critical power, our next delineating threshold. Continue on up the exercise intensity and the power, and you will hit MAP, so the power output at which you would achieve VO2 max. And then this would also continue until you reach your maximum sprint speed, the maximum capacity that you can generate or develop in 1 or 2 seconds. You can't generate any more power than your maximum sprint power output. And that would be our sort of top line of this figure. So they are our delineating features. Now, what I want to do is to try and describe to you what are the physiological responses within these domains, because I think this is what is important to determine what's typical about these particular zones or these particular domains, because there are very different physiological responses when you exercise in these particular domains. So if you are exercising under lactate threshold, at a power output that is below lactate threshold. So if we know from your physiological testing your lactate threshold is 200 watts, then anything underneath that, you have a very characteristic physiological response. And if we take VO2, for example, so the oxygen uptake, and if we put time on this axis, we know at the start of exercise there's the characteristic increase in VO2 kinetics, but effectively you reach a steady state. You reach a steady state where VO2 doesn't change at all. And effectively, you can continue that intensity of exercise theoretically indefinitely. Okay, you can continue until you get bored, or you get too hot and sweaty, or your bottom starts to hurt, or whatever, or you run out of fuel. So that's a steady state exercise that allows you to continue exercise theoretically indefinitely. If we increase the power output and increase the exercise intensity so that you're exercising somewhere between lactate threshold and critical power, you see a slightly different physiological response, where we have this so-called slow component, so this excess VO2, excess oxygen uptake that is sort of additional onto what you would expect to see in a steady state. The mechanisms of this slow component, I think we can sort of safely say, is due to changes in fibre type recruitment, a gradual increase in type 2 fibres that are perhaps less efficient. But effectively, we have this excess VO2 that continues to project. But under CP, this does, to a certain extent, reach a steady state. So you can sort of, over a period of time, reach a steady state in VO2 as this exercise continues. But it will continue to project up very, 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 very slightly. And broadly speaking, this sort of exercise you can tolerate this exercise for 2 to 3, maybe 2 to 3.5 hours. So that it is limited in that sense. But we get this characteristic slow component in between lactate threshold and critical power. So different to below lactate threshold. Once you increase the intensity above critical power, then things start to get a little bit different in the sense that because the oxygen uptake isn't matching the demands at which is required, VO2 continues to project upwards, and there's a greater reliance on anaerobic energy metabolism, and eventually you will hit and reach VO2 max. So you will reach VO2 max within a fairly short period of time, maybe 20, 30, perhaps up to 40 minutes of duration. Above critical power, you will hit VO2 max, and ultimately you will stop exercising due to fatigue-related mechanisms. So this is where we're defining CP as our critical, our very important fatigue threshold. And if you're exercising above critical power, you will fatigue in a relatively short period of time. Again, if we progress upwards in terms of increasing the power to around exercise intensities around MAP, that is even shorter. You'll continue exercise, VO2 projects upwards very, very rapidly, and again you will hit VO2 max, and after a matter of minutes perhaps, you will fatigue for various reasons. So you can see the very different physiological responses within these domains that are rigorous and reproducible. You will observe these all the time. And it's not just for pulmonary VO2, you see a similar sort of relationship or a similar sort of pattern with blood lactate concentration. Not that lactate causes fatigue, that's another story, but it's very, very correlated with the performance capabilities. But again, below lactate threshold, by definition, of course, you're not producing any excess lactate. But in this domain, you are reach your so-called maximal lactate steady state. And again, I appreciate that there's a bit of a controversy at the moment as to whether critical power and maximal lactate steady state are synonymous. I think that's another important debate to have. And again, above critical power, blood lactate continues to increase and you will fatigue in a relatively short period of time. So these are rigorous physiological responses to exercise within these domains. And Brian Whipp, in his seminal paper in, I think it was 1996, provided an element of some definitions and some titles for these domains. So under lactate threshold, it was termed moderate, so moderate intensity exercise. Exercising between lactate threshold and critical power, he termed heavy exercise, so the heavy domain. Above critical power, but below maximum aerobic power, he termed the very heavy domain of exercise, and anything that is typically above maximum aerobic power, so intense exercise, was termed severe exercise or the severe domain. Now again, physiologists are a crazy bunch and we're already starting to fiddle with those definitions already, and I think there's good justification for it. And I'm looking carefully at Steve O'Bailey here with his previous supervisor Andy Jones and David Poole and some great scientists from there, and they've started to sort of tinker with the terminology, which is quite right. I don't mind that at all. And this is their definitions of the domains of exercise. So they've kept moderate, which is very nice. Heavy, which is okay, so between lactate and critical power is heavy, but anything above critical power they've termed severe. So they've switched these definitions around a little bit, and I think that's fairly okay. They've got another definition of extreme, which is at the very top end, so any sort of extreme exercise where you're exercising at power outputs close to your maximum sprint speed, so 30 seconds of duration, a Wingate type power output, they've termed extreme. But these are, roughly speaking, very kind of very rigorous definitions of the domains of exercise. So I think that's where we're going in this field of exercise physiology. So with that in mind, what I want to try and do for you before I try and sort of do some mapping with the traditional zones that I mentioned at the start is to give you a flavour or give you an idea of how you can determine these domains of exercise. So what can you do practically that will help you, determine these domains? And of course that means understanding how we can test for lactate threshold, critical power and MAP if that's important at all. So of course we've heard David talk about lactate threshold, and we had a very nice chat with Rona and the team in SDC about how you can determine lactate threshold, and of course there are issues about the different types of terminology and the different definitions of it. And of course you need, if you're going to do it properly, you need some specialized equipment, including a lactate measuring device, carefully controlled workloads, and so on, and the capability to perform that sort of exercise test, usually in a laboratory. So I appreciate that these are usually performed in a laboratory. And of course, Rona has a service to sort of, if you can pay your however many pounds you want to, you can come into the SDC and have your lactate threshold tested in a very professional manner, and they will do a very good job. So that's a limitation in the fact that it's you know, it's requires specialist equipment, and you need to sort of know what you're doing in terms of plotting the curves and having the various definition of lactate threshold. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit, because there's a suggestion that there might be other ways to do it based upon some of the data that we've got, very preliminary data. So let's go to the power, the critical power concept and determining critical power. And of course, what we're really referring to is this characteristic relationship between power output and duration. And what's important is your ability to control power output quite carefully. So you can do multiple square wave or multiple constant load exercises for, you know, between 2 and 15 minutes is the typical time that you want to sort of exercise before making sure that you're exercising to complete exhaustion. And then when you do those multiple exercises, probably on different days, then you can plot that characteristic relationship. Of course, it helps if you've got a power trainer or a smart power trainer that allows you to control the power output. You need to fix the power and measure the duration. So you fix the power at, say, 250 watts, start the clock, and go for as long as you can until exhaustion. So it's very important that you're able to control the power. You don't have to do too much fancy maths. So, you know, we don't need a sort of a degree in maths to do this particular equation, because you can make it a little bit easier. And all you do to do that is you take the time that you've measured and do a 1 divided by time sum, and then plot a straight line through that relationship. So you plot a simple regression through that relationship, and where it meets the axis here, that is your value of critical power. Okay, so it's a fairly relatively robust and fairly reasonable way of calculating critical power using these multiple time to exhaustion tests. Of course, we're talking about, you know, if you've got a Wahoo kicker, but since the sponsors are in the room, or some of our sponsors are in the room here, I have to plug, maybe you could buy a Watt Bike Atom and do your testing on that. All right, Rich? But that, of course, depends upon being able to fix the power output. And that's, you don't often have those devices, or you might want to do it on the road. Of course, it depends upon you having a power meter, so I appreciate that. You know, you might want to invest in a power meter, whether it's your Garmin pedals or whatever. But having that ability to fix the power output is difficult in many ways. So there's an alternative way that you could do this. And all we do really is we take this power duration relationship and just flip it on its head. So what you're really going to do is you're going to fix the duration and measure the power from your device. So it's simply flipping the same relationship. You're still measuring power on your power meter, you're measuring time, and you're doing the reverse. So you're doing a duration-power relationship. And what we seem to be doing now, and what's come out in the literature, is standard periods of time that you can do this for. So if you have a 3-minute exercise, so you fix the duration at 3 minutes, do an intense bout of exercise, measure the average power for that period, you've got 1 point of that power duration relationship in that critical power curve. Equally, you can do a 6-minute one, or around about 6 minutes. The literature is mixed on this. Some are 5 minutes, some maybe 7 minutes. It doesn't really matter, as long as it's in the middle. And you can do a 12-minute or anything like that, maybe up to 15 minutes, fix the duration and measure the power. So the sort of observation that you might get from your power meter is this. This is your 3-minute fixed duration exercise, and you have a bit of a spurt at the start, and then you gradually get it down, and then you're exhausted by the end. Fix the duration, measure the average power. In this case, it's 305 watts. Do a 6-minute bout, fix the duration, measure the power, 265 watts, and the same there for the 12 minutes. So you've got those 3 powers and those 3 durations. What's critical here is that you are completely exhausted in the end. You have to be, because that's the nature of the relationship. So clearly pacing becomes an important component for this kind of test, and is potentially a limiting factor of this. So you need to be completely exhausted at the end, otherwise you're sort of not fulfilling the requirements for the power duration relationship. And then you would plot that straight line between those 3 data points, and you get your critical power data out of it. Indeed, I've been talking about doing three exercise tests, and there's some lovely data come out from Len Parker-Simpson's lab, when he was working at British Cycling, in that you don't necessarily have to do 3 exercise trials. And there's a very close relationship, a very strong relationship between if you do it 3 times, so 3, 5 minutes and 12 minutes, but equally you get similar values of critical power if you just do it twice. So you can do a 3 and a 12 minute, plot those curves. Clearly it'll be a straight line and the R value will be 1, but it's tightly coupled and very closely related with a 3 power model. There is an argument about whether you should do it on the same day or not, and in this study from Len and Medicordi, I think the recovery period between the 3 and the 12 minutes was about 40 minutes. So you do a 3 minute, have a 40-minute recovery, and do your 12 minutes. Clearly this study was done in top elite cyclists. I think it was the top guys and the top girls at British Cycling, and they may have that recovery capacity. In our experiences with our sort of less trained, still very, very fit athletes, maybe you need a little bit longer to have a little bit of a longer recovery between those 3 and 12 minutes, but that's open for contention. But also there are some concerns, and this is nice data from Louis Passfield, that the difference between doing a time trial, and what I mean by a time trial is fixing the duration, and doing a time to exhaustion where you fix the power output, there's a bit of contentious issue between the validity of doing those trials. So what Louis Passfield has demonstrated that if you do a time to exhaustion, so a time to exhaustion here, so a classic fixing the power, measure the duration, or a time trial where you fix the duration and measure the power, at the higher intensities, it's okay. You can get similar power outputs. But at the lower intensities, sort of the 12, 15-minute duration, you get quite a significant difference in the average power output between the 2 ways of doing it. And this results in a fairly robust difference in your assessment of critical power. So really, if you're going to do the time trial, that really sort of underestimates what would be the true critical power. So you need to think carefully about which performance trial you want. If you're wanting an extremely accurate measurement and perhaps gold standard assessment of critical power, you need to use the traditional time to exhaustion, fix the power and measure the time, because you're underestimating it by 10, 15, 20 watts, if that's important to you. So things to think about in terms of which particular test you should be doing to determine critical power. I'm going to sort of throw a grenade into the mix here now and talk very briefly about FTP, because FTP is the ubiquitous term that cyclists band about quite a lot, and for good reason, because it's a very useful but contentious test, and it's been coined. And the reason I got into this sort of area of work is because it just comes out of nowhere. I turn my Garmin on that I just bought, and the first thing that comes on is, what is your FTP? You go onto Trainer Roads, and everything is based around FTP. And it's cool. I read his book, and it's a really good book. But the question is I was asking perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, perhaps naively, WTF is FTP? What is FTP? And again, a bit naughty, I have to say. But I think I've calmed down a little bit, thankfully, because of Paul Morgan's data. With Steve-O and Andy Jones, because they sort of beat me to it, as it were, which is very nice. I don't mind at all, and did a really nice study, recently published in Journal of Sports Science, amongst other things, and found a very nice, almost perfect relationship. That dashed line is the line of identity, so y equals x, so a one-to-one relationship. And the relationship between FTP and critical power is almost bang on. They're almost on top of each other. So CP, in some ways, is FTP, or the other way around. FTP is CP. Now, they qualified this, I don't know why they qualified this, because there are errors. There is error, of course, so limits of agreement, some statistical analysis to sort of consider that's too large to use them interchangeably. But, I'm sort of quite convinced that, FTP is CP. And there's other data to demonstrate that FTP is very closely correlated to 4 millimole obla. So there's sort of the second lactate threshold. So I'm kind of, I've relaxed a little bit about, what is FTP, because I'm just going to use it, interchangeably between that and CP. So coming back to the lactate threshold and to try to wrap up, I think this is throwing it out there. So I'm prepared for some criticism and, sort of shoot me down here, because is there a way of determining, if we can't get access to a laboratory, we can't get access to a lactate measuring device, take blood samples from the ear, are there ways of determining lactate threshold, that first lactate threshold from any of these tests? And this is some data that I'm sort of, this is brand new, and I'm delighted that some of the subjects are in the audience today. So I really appreciate you coming, because this is your data in this study. And a couple of students are here that have been working on this study are also in the audience. Because we've been trying to sort of address this question and do a very sort of pragmatic, mapping of all the different thresholds that you can determine, compare things to critical power, measured the traditional way or measured the sort of non-traditional way, and try and correlate them around each other. And what we've demonstrated, or just very preliminary, is that if you measure critical power, this is using the proper, the power duration method, so fixing the power, and correlate it with lactate threshold, so the first lactate turn point. We're showing very roughly that LT1 is approximately 75% of CP. So if you can determine CP, you can do a rough estimation from that value to estimate lactate threshold without having to do a lactate threshold test. Now, I appreciate there's some variability, and in fact it's quite large, and it's it's not quite sort of following the line of best fit. So there's still sort of room for manoeuvre here. But if you're able to assess critical power, from that you can determine, or sort of have a good guess at lactate threshold and determine that first zone or that first domain. So what I want to try and do to summarize is to really try and clear up, where do these fit? So where do these domains fit? And it's all relative to CP. So clearly CP is this delineator between heavy and severe. So if you can determine CP, this is where you get your heavy and severe delineator. And from this, if you get CP in, you can have a rough estimation of lactate threshold 1. So determine that moderate zone. I appreciate there's quite a large variation here, so you have to sort of understand that and take that into consideration. But I think it's at this stage, it's around about 75%. And I know Dave Nichols has presented very similar data from testing the Loughborough cycling squad, and has come up with a very similar value. So there's a body of data building up that 75% of CP is kind of the sort of take-home message. And what I want to do here is try and map this against the traditional, ubiquitous, dogmatic FTP zones, okay, which is sort of, again, different to Dave's Australian zoning system. But here we go. This is a rough kind of attempt to map them onto each other. And if we know now from Paul's data very nicely that FTP is nearly CP, or is CP, then this is where their zone is. So this is the threshold zone 4, but it spans the 2. And what we know is that, of course, if you're under FTP or CP, even by 5%, you can reach that sort of steady state exercise. Classic data from David Poole in 1988. You're even 5% under CP, you can achieve steady state. If you go 5% above CP, you're in that severe domain, and everything projects upwards, and you've got about 20 minutes before you have to stop. So, this is a little bit of concern. But thankfully, their sort of zone 2 and zone 3 between high, steady, and recovery is very, fairly well mapped. If you calculate the FTP for zone 2 is 75%, or that zone up to 75%, then it's mapping quite nicely. So we're not doing too badly at all against these traditional FTP-related zones. But I think the message from today, from my perspective, and you can disagree if you want, is that there's an argument of utilising these domain terminology because the physiological responses between the three domains is quite different. So to summarise, I think that's my sort of 25 minutes or so, whatever it is. I think to summarise, we can delineate our exercise domains by robust physiological thresholds. Lactate threshold and that first lactate turn point, critical power, and if you're interested in MAP, so the VO2 max intensities, you can determine that. My suggestion, and I think with some of my colleagues would agree with me, maybe some of you don't, is that if you're going to do a CP test, preferably do the power duration relationship, the gold standard power duration. Fix the power, measure the duration, if you have the capability of doing that. But equally, if you don't, then you can use the alternative version, the duration power, so fix the duration and measure the power. And this robust measurement using the 3 minutes and the 12 minutes from Medicordi and Len Parker-Simpson are, equally valid. And I think from our data, which is very preliminary, there is some way of estimating lactate threshold from critical power, but I think we need a little bit more data to firm that relationship up and maybe provide some sort of regression equation that might be used in the future, perhaps to sort of, you get CP, you put it into the regression equation, boom, there's lactate threshold. So that's me. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I've sort of covered something for you. And
Thank you, Richard. We'll break very shortly for, I think, 15 minutes now for some more refreshments and some nibbles outside. I'm going to attempt to sum up and, again, to reinforce the point, to write down your questions and your thoughts, perhaps your challenges for the roundtable discussion at the end. You can see there was a certain dilemma in putting the symposium together of which should follow which in this first half of the content. Was it David's or Richard's? I think trying to pull them together, there's clearly an emerging consensus about how we map the exercise intensity duration spectrum and the extraordinary body of science now being done to look at how training in those various zones might be moving towards some optimization. But I guess a clue to the second half of the symposium was lurking in one of your slides, I think, Richard, about some of the data disparity at the lower intensities about just how long somebody is going to exercise for, depending on whether there's a time factor or an intensity factor. And I think that hints at where we're going to go in the first session after the break with Ian, and looking at the motivation and perhaps the psychological elements, which up until now have barely received a mention. So with that in mind, and then we move to the final session, which looks at the real world, the practical world of, even at the highest levels of pro cycling, some of the limitations and challenges that we see there. So with that in mind, we'll have a short 15-minute break. We'll come back and start again at 5 to 8. Thank you. So our third presenter this evening is Dr. Ian Taylor. When I met Ian to talk about how he'd like me to introduce him, I asked him how he would describe himself as a psychologist. And I think the phrase we settled on was a motivation psychologist, not a motivational psychologist, which I think probably sounds a little bit more like somebody who can persuade me I'm a lion and I can walk through a wall. And I think actually you're a little bit more science-oriented than that.
Hopefully.
In your approach.
Yeah.
And a recreational cyclist of some renown.
Absolutely, as that picture suggests. Yeah.
So Ian, it's over to you to perhaps knock a few holes in this hard reality perspective on what limits us and what we can do about it.
Thanks, Peter. As we've alluded to, I do feel a bit of an outsider in this primarily physiological world. I've seen one psychologist, but he's snuck at the back. Is there any other psychologists or people with a psychology slant to their work? Good. There you go. And I'm also, as the picture suggests, I'm a recreational cyclist at best. I go off to Spain and France a little bit to do some cycling and to eat very large prawns as well. As Peter alluded to, I study motivation. I don't necessarily, or I haven't traditionally studied motivational cycling or any particular context. I studied motivation. But I was interested in cycling, and so the last sort of 2 or 3 years, I've started studying motivational processes in cycling, but also other sort of endurance type activities. And actually, over those couple of years, endurance activities are actually, I think, the best petri dish, their best context to study motivational processes that I'm going to talk about. So I'm getting more and more into endurance activities as I progress. Nonetheless, like I said, it's a couple of years old, this program, so it's in its infancy. So some of the stuff is what I'm going to suggest is hypotheses. Some of the ideas might have some sort of proof of principle ideas, basic data, and some might be, actually, we've got sort of some decent evidence in cycling. So probably at the end of this lecture, there's going to be more questions than answers. But I want to sort of talk about motivation in an experimental way during the endurance activity itself, not the reasons that you partake in cycling or anything like that. That's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. So bearing in mind that you're all psychologists, let's dig into some physiology and rip it to pieces, or not. No, I'm definitely not going to do that. So these are obviously physiologists. And it was only when I started talking to Richard that he sent me this paper. And obviously, if you're studying motivation, this statement is going to leap out at you. And admittedly, I'm sort of cherry-picking a statement. They're talking about severe level exercise. But nonetheless, I think that to say task failure is purely physical is a big, big statement to state, even at these severe and high-intensity levels. And I also think there's some nuances to that statement as well. Sort of, when they speak about motivation, they're probably talking about something very different to what I think of as motivational processes. For example, encouragement and coercion during the testing is probably what they're thinking about. And I'm thinking about something completely different. But is motivation important? Well, no, according to that. But if you sort of just pick out an anecdote, so hopefully Alex Dowsett knows a little about high-intensity exercise, as he's pretty fast over 1 hour, or does a long distance over 1 hour. And I just picked this up off the popular media the other day, and it sort of suggests that motivation is important. Okay? So when he's getting the message that he's losing, suffering for nothing's not very nice. And yet, if he's told he's winning, i.e. motivational feedback, the pain disappears. Okay, and we'll revisit that idea later on with a bit of data. So I'm going to go on this side, that motivation is important for endurance performance. And hopefully you can sort of think, if you've done endurance activities yourself, not just cycling, if you've ever finished an endurance activity and thought, could I have gone faster? Could I have gone harder? Then it's a motivational question. Okay, the answer is probably yes if you're thinking that. Okay, so motivation is important, I think. But what specifically am I going to be focusing on for this talk? Well, you have a goal. Okay, you have a performance goal. Now, I'm going to keep that idea fairly broad. Okay, it could be winning a race. It could be setting a time. But there's a performance goal, okay, that's distal, the reason why you're doing that activity. To set a certain time in training, for example, there's a performance goal, okay? And competing with that performance goal is the fact that it hurts, okay? Intense and severe exercise hurts, okay? And whether it's small or large, there is a desire to stop, okay? People do not like things that hurt, okay? So that is a motivational decision. You have the distal goal, okay? I want to do well, I want to set a fast time, I want to win, I want to set a time of X, etc. But it's conflicting with the proximal desire to either stop or more likely slow down. or even more likely slow down by a little bit to relieve the discomfort. And again, I'm keeping the phrase discomfort quite broad. It could be uncomfortable from a thermal perspective, uncomfort from a respiratory perspective. So I'm keeping it broad, performance-related discomfort, okay? So that's what I'm talking about for this talk, this motivational dilemma, okay? Performance, desire, conflict, okay? Those three facets. And again, just to illustrate, again, I just picked this off the popular media. This is Eleanor Barker talking about the 2016 Team Pursuit. There is absolutely a goal, a performance goal. It is the gold medal or a set time or whatever. And there's a considerable amount of pain in the team pursuit. And it's resisting the desire to slow down, even by minuscule amounts. That is what I'm talking about when I mean motivation. Now, this is my very complex slide. So we're talking rough estimates. You've got time on the x-axis. And at the beginning of a time trial or any sort of endurance activity, you've got a goal of a certain strength, okay, an arbitrary strength. And at the beginning, the desire to stop and slow down is not very high because it's not very painful, okay? And as you go forward, okay, it gets hurt harder and harder and harder and harder and harder. And that desire to stop gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, okay? And it's when that the motivational properties of the desire and the goal are similar, that is when you've got a critical motivational phase. I'm going to call it a motivational sweet spot now. So we've got a motivational sweet spot, okay? This is the absolute critical, it's the decision to slow down or not in pursuit of that goal, okay? So that's what we're talking about if we zone in. When it's hurting, if you're asking yourself some questions, can I keep this momentum up? Can I keep this level of effort up? Can I keep these watts up, okay? If you're not sure, that's that critical motivational phase. Now, there's some big characteristics about this critical motivational phase. One, it is highly salient. It is conscious, okay? It's not some unconscious thing going on in the background. It's conscious. It's a decision, okay? It's highly salient, okay? If you verbalize your thoughts during these periods, most of it will be about pain and discomfort and resisting them, okay? So there's some evidence from other research where on an outside road time trial, 33% are about the pain and the discomfort of all verbalized thoughts, okay? And if you think that's outside, and most of the others were about, I need to watch that car, otherwise I'm going to die, okay? So it's highly salient. There's not a lot else going on in these critical motivational phases, okay? Especially in fairly simple endurance activities. But there's lots of characteristics that heavily weigh the odds in the favor of the desire. So we've got problems, okay? If you boil motivation down to its simplest properties, humans do not like things that hurt, okay? And they do like things that are pleasurable, okay? That's the most basic motivational principle that you can get, okay? And as we know, endurance activities hurt. So you're fighting against a human temptation already. So you're weighing the odds in the favor of the desire. There's a whole host of evidence that says the conflict between the desire and the goal increases as effort increases. And so in endurance activities, effort is high. Therefore, the conflict is high. The temptation, the desire to slow down is high in periods of high effort. So we weigh the odds further in favor of the desire. The desire-goal conflict also increases the number of systems recruited in that activity. Sport is one of the most complex activities humans do. Okay? So again, we're increasing the conflict. We're using neuromuscular, respiratory, endocrine, psychology, etc., etc. We're using all systems. So the conflict is huge, which weighs the odds in the desire's favor even further. But we can do things to swing the odds back in towards the performance goal and the achievement of the performance goal. You ready for this? Stop it. You can lower the desire. If you lower the desire, the critical phase disappears, and so forth. Are you ready for this one? You can increase the goal. People go faster when there's a bigger motivational goal. People go faster when there's a gold medal, when there's a free piece of protein bar on offer. Okay? So you can if you look at it systematically, you've got a desire and a goal and a conflict between the two, you can systematically shift those elements to either remove the critical phase or certainly delay the critical phase, okay? The critical sweet spot, if you like. And so that's what I'm starting to try and do. Shift these goals and desires to manipulate the desire-goal conflict so we enhance performance. Okay. So can we influence the motivational inputs to lessen the strength of the desire? Can we increase the motivational inputs towards the goal? Or actually, can you actually play around with the conflict itself as the second question that I'm starting to look into? Those are the research questions that are fueling this program. So if we look at the motivational inputs, first of all, what are the key motivational inputs for the desire and the goal? There's things like this. So a lot of people are researching perceived exertion and effort. The greater the effort, the bigger the desire. So the amount of effort, the amount of perceived effort, if your perceived effort is high, the desire to slow down is going to be higher. So that is a motivational input, the exertion, the amount of exertion and effort. There's also the nociception, the perceptions of pain. Okay? If it's hurting, your desire to slow down is going to be increased. Okay? Affect is an important one. Not just the level of exertion, but the emotional label that you give that. So sometimes, hopefully, we all know that a high level of exertion feels pretty good. But then there are other days that that same level of exertion feels horrific. Okay? So the emotional label to that exertion is important. And then what I think is a big opportunity for research is these other key physiological signals. For example, the guys were talking a lot about lactic acid and lactate. Okay? My rudimentary graph where the desire goes linear is probably highly inaccurate. Once your body goes over the lactate threshold, you're probably going to get a big step change in desire, because that's a big signal to the brain to say, this is not right. Something's going wrong. You need to stop, or you need to slow down, I think. So these are the sort of key motivational inputs, certainly towards the desire. Okay, so can we manipulate them? Can we shift them? They can be easily shifted. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you an example outside of your aerobic endurance, a more postural endurance task, but it shows you how simply things can be shifted. Okay. For example, we did a study where it was a repeated measure, so the participants did two conditions. Okay, both did conditions. In both conditions, there were a 4-minute Stroop test. Okay, so not particularly long. We weren't cognitively fatiguing them for hours. So 4 minutes of a Stroop test. In one condition, it was your typical Stroop test that you see there. So the middle one, yellow should actually be said was red. I think I'm colourblind, so I think it's red. Yeah. And so forth. And the blue one should be actually called black, the typical Stroop test, okay? In the other condition, they had a Stroop test, but the blue word was blue, the yellow word was yellow, the red word was red. So there was it was just easy. It was just naming colours, if you like. So essentially we had an incongruent Stroop, that one, versus a congruent Stroop, the easy one, okay? And then, as a little experimental study, we just got people to do a wall sit. Okay, so these are the same people doing the wall sit twice, once with a hard Stroop, once with an easy Stroop. Okay, and seeing how long they lasted on the wall sit, on separate days. Okay. This is what happened. So we give them a 4-minute wall Stroop. When it was hard, they lasted for about 130 seconds. When it was easy, they lasted 147, I think that was. Okay, so a big difference in performance. So these are the same people doing the same wall sit on a different day, and they lasted considerably longer at this endurance task. But what was even more interesting was why they lasted longer. Just by doing the Stroop beforehand, they thought the same wall sit was considerably more painful. Well, not considerably, a small but statistically significant increase in pain, okay, at the beginning of the trial. So this data is from the early in the trial. So they're just thinking that the wall sit is feeling harder, okay, even after just 4 minutes. So you can easily shift things. So there's other data from other labs where perceived exertion can be shifted, affect can be shifted. It's pretty easy to do it, okay? The problem is the effect is also pretty flaky. It's easily done, but it's also easily not done as well. We don't really know how it's systematic, how it can be done systematically. So that's a big question. So we know we've made a breakthrough that these perceptions, these motivational inputs towards the desire can be shifted, but we can't yet do it that systematically. In the most studies I've done, it's worked, some it hasn't. Okay. Let's go back to this Alex Dowsett. The Alex Dowsett effect. He was saying, when you're getting feedback to say you're winning, will you improve performance? And if you're losing, will it decrease in performance? Okay, so let's test that. Okay. But what we add is these motivational inputs as mechanisms. Okay. Does negative or positive feedback influence how you're feeling regarding your exertion and your affect, okay, during the cycling performance? Okay. So this is in a 16-kilometer time trial. Okay. And how we did it, well, we had your fairly typical cycling output, but we just faked it. So we've got a fake leaderboard in the middle here, and essentially they thought they were sort of getting feedback on where they were in this hypothetical league table. And so after 2 minutes, they might go up one, and we did it sort of hopefully fairly realistic, where it didn't just go up uniformly every 2 minutes. And then we told them they were third and they were doing well, so they were going up this leaderboard as they were putting effort in. And in the losing one, they steadily went down the leaderboard. And actually, they weren't. There was no leaderboard. Has anyone been a participant in this? You're not allowed to be either now, because you know what's happening. So don't. If someone says, yeah, sign up for a cycling study, don't. So that's what we did, okay? But we also measured the exertion, how much effort they're putting in, and the affect as well. Okay. Now, we've only studied a few participants, but there's some little bit interesting patterns that I want to show. So when I say very preliminary data, I mean it's preliminary data. But in this graph, we've got the losing condition in the red, I think it is, and winning in blue, purple, whatever it is. And on the y-axis, there's a correlation between RPE and performance. Okay, so is RPE predicting performance? Is it correlated with performance? Okay. And actually, in the losing conditions, in this axis, these are a quartile 1 of the time trial. Okay, so quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. And performance, we're talking average watts in that quarter. Okay. And at any quarter, at the minute, RPE is more predictive when you're losing. So in other words, the question is, if this sort of data transpires into a bit more robust finding, when you're losing, is RPE more important for performance than affect? Possibly. So it's not necessarily affect, it's RPE in losing conditions. In the affect graph, we're not really seeing much pattern yet. Okay, RPE seems to be more systematic. It's more correlated with performance when you're losing. Okay. But one interesting one that I found, just scanning the data, is, so it's not winning or losing now, it's just RPE versus affect. Okay. And RPE is much lower correlated with performance compared to affect. Okay, so you would expect affect, the harder you're going, if you're going at a slightly harder wattage, you would expect the negative affect to increase. But RPE is not actually that correlated with performance. Okay, so you might be able to shift RPE, okay, and keep performance constant. Okay, so again, we're seeing a sign that that may be shiftable because there's a low correlation, whereas affect is a bit more robust. If performance is going well, a negative effect is pretty high because it's distressing. Okay. But like I say, there's more questions with this data yet than answers. Is affect more important or perceived effort more variable? Does RPE increase its motivational importance when losing? These are interesting questions that we'll carry on looking at. So there's some ideas about sort of motivational inputs. Yes, they can be shifted, but we need to shift them a bit more systematically. Okay. And the second research question I said, but can we focus on the conflict and sort of manipulate the actual conflict without going up and down in desire? And the answer is yes, you can. And some of this research is taken from Gestalt psychology, as there's only one psychologist in here, only one person knows what Gestalt psychology is, but it's from Germany, 1890s. And there's a lot of things that can be applied to endurance activities. If you think of the activity of resisting a desire, think of it a means to an end, okay? The end is the performance goal. The means is the activity of resisting the desire, okay? Now, I've spoken about it as being in conflict with each other, okay? But actually, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You can fuse the means and the end, and so they're working together, okay? As an example, try and think of an athlete who wants to win the race or wants to set the same time, but he sees, oh, this is going to hurt though. I've got to really overcome this pain as a barrier, okay? That's differentiated, that's not fused. In contrast, if you take an athlete who equally wants to win or set the same time to the same motivational strength, but sees the means overcoming that desire to slow down as part of that goal, okay? To do that goal, it is necessary to resist the temptation. They are much more fused, they are much more aligned, okay? So they're working together rather than against each other, okay? And you can do that quite easily. You can do that by tapping into this idea of immediacy, okay? If you get feedback at the very immediate end, okay, has the end been achieved by the means, straight away, they will be more fused, okay? If you think about, I have an idea that if all else being equal, the person who starts the time trial last will win because he gets more immediate feedback whether that resistance of temptation has been successful or not. So if you could hypothetically do the same athlete or an avatar, okay, so we're not talking about, yeah, but the better athlete starts last, okay? All other things equal, if the feedback that the means has achieved the end is immediate, they are more fused. Whereas if you do the activity, resist, have I achieved my goal? Well, I'll find out in 3 hours, then they're more distinct, okay? And so there'll be less persistence. You can also do it with repeated coupling. Now, repeated coupling is to do with the experience, okay? Leads to the performance goal, okay? And experiencing that and learning about that and doing it and repeated coupling. In neuroscience, they have this phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. Okay, and it's the same principle here, okay? If you repeatedly practice the effect of resisting that temptation to the performance goal, they will be more fused. And the last one is linkage uniqueness. If there's only one means to the end, then they will be more fused compared to if there's several means to the end, okay? So the only way to achieve the performance goal is to resist that temptation to slow down. You can't adjust your technique. You can't focus on brute strength. The only way, if you perceive it that way, okay, you will have more persistence, okay? And we've got, again, some initial data on this. So in one condition, we said the only way to do a good wall sit is to push through the discomfort. That is the only way you're going to do well at this wall sit. Okay? That's a unique linkage. One means, one end. Whereas in the other condition, the same people doing it, actually, there's different ways. We lied to you in the first condition. Okay? There's 4 ways. There's 4 means. Okay? You can either push through the discomfort, but you can focus on your posture. You can focus on quadricep strength, or you do a combination of all 3. So again, these are the same people doing the wall sit. And we had some changes. I've shown some conservative means there. Because it's a novel task, we've got to account for order effects. If you account them, you have big, big differences. But for simplicity, I've just done the raw means. But when it's a unique means, people persist longer. Okay? And so our first study on this fusion idea in total, what we did, we created a ruse. So it was a time to exhaustion time trial, 80% of maximal heart rate, and see how long they come. Not elite cyclists, but fit people. And in one condition, we gave them this ruse that elite athletes have got this new training program where it's all about this fusion, that they see the performance discomfort as part of the goal. Okay? The only way to do good performance is to experience discomfort repeatedly, experience discomfort and train for it, etc., etc. And in the other condition, actually, there's this new training program where they keep that separate. So the pain is separate. That's an obstacle, that a barrier needs to be overcome. Okay? And so that was the differentiated condition. And what we found is people lasted nearly a minute longer on the time to exhaustion trial. So big in statistical significance there. So that's our first. It was fairly sort of an applied sort of ruse. It wasn't sort of systematically done about those 3 different antecedents of fusion. But we looked at fusion holistically and said, let's make a story up based on fusion. Okay? And we found some interesting differences. So we can look at motivation and fuse the activity, we think. Okay. So, as I said at the very beginning, that this is an early program of research, okay? And Ferg said, put some applied implications in at the end. Okay, so I did. So in terms of the repeated coupling, you've got to think, actually, this needs to be practiced, okay? In the same way you would practice any other element of performance, you have to practice resisting the desire of the discomfort, resisting the desire to slow down, actually. And what I would guess is that elite athletes actually do that, but do it with trial and error, okay? I think we can systematically do it with developing athletes and get them there quicker, okay? In terms of uniqueness, obviously there's endurance activities where there are different means. You can win races tactically. You can win races in other ways. But for fairly simple things, for example, if you're training on an ergometer, that is a simple endurance activity, okay? If you focus on, I'll try my posture this time, and I'll try and focus on this, that you're creating different means to the end, okay? You need one means to the end, okay? And then in terms of a sort of coaching implication, if you are practicing endurance elements and practicing this resistance to discomfort, okay, the feedback needs to be immediate, okay? You need to know whether that means has achieved the end, okay? So, hopefully, I've convinced you that motivation is important for endurance. I think it is. I think, hopefully, if you're rational, you say it can't be purely physical. There has to be a motivational decision in it. Relevant cues can be shifted, absolutely. The problem is we don't know how to shift them automatically yet, or systematically, I should say. Okay. And actually trying to fuse the temptation to align that with the goal, I think can have quite interesting implications for endurance performance. Thanks for listening to a psychologist.
Ian, thank you for putting the proverbial cat amongst the many physiological pigeons in the room, I think. Please think of your questions and your challenges, keep a note of them, and then we'll try and pull it all together. A little bit later than planned, but it's all good stuff. So I think we now move to the presentation that hopefully will integrate and bring to a very practical level the realities of both the science and the art that we've been exploring this evening. So real pleasure to introduce Dave Nichols, who is one of our returning stars of the past in terms of an undergraduate and postgraduate career. Dave has recently been appointed our manager of high performance cycling. Fascinating new challenge for you. And prior to that was providing sports science support for a world tour team, Dimension Data, and prior to that completing his PhD at the Aspetar Centre in Doha. So David, I think you're going to take us into the world of professional cycling. So I need you to...
Yeah, let's load it up. Yeah, so Richard asked me to present today looking at some of the observations and work I did in Dimension Data last year in the World Tour. And I think some of it will hopefully challenge some of the science and again raise more questions and really show what we don't know, perhaps. And I think if you ever get a chance, look at Mod Cycling Photo. It was Scott Mitchell, the team photographer last year. Absolutely brilliant galleries, so do take a look at his pictures. I wanted to start talking about my journey into pro cycling. I won't dwell on this too long, but I think there's many, many students in the room who perhaps will be looking for a career in sport. So this was my kind of route through it. And actually, it all started here, and not just here in Loughborough, here in this room. I was a sports scientist in 2010, and I'd have been sat 9 years ago like the reprobates at the back here today. And I'm sure Richard will attest to that. Starting my undergraduate degree here. 2014, I carried on, couldn't leave the place, and did a master's in exercise physiology. And that all sounds pretty reasonable for someone wanting to work in sport. Then I took a rather unusual step and moved to the desert in Qatar. And I spent 3 years studying for a PhD in Aspetar Sports Medicine Hospital. My PhD focused on heat acclimation. I dabbled in a little bit of altitude and the effects of those environments on cycling performance. And I'm not going to talk too much about my PhD research today. It's not really relevant to pro cycling. But interestingly, and what you might observe in those dates, 2014 to 2017, in the middle of that was the UCI World Championships in Doha. And it was on the little man-made island in the Pearl. It went past my front door on multiple laps of that circuit. And I was fortunate enough to take part in a research project there, and we measured some of the core temperature, the heart rate, the power data from the riders taking part in the World Championships, and we're definitely going to come back to that in a little bit. And at the end of 2017, I had a job offer to go into Dimension Data and work, as Peter said, as a coach and sports scientist in the World Tour outfit. 9 years on, a bit older, hopefully a little bit wiser, I'm back here today, and with the goal of launching this high-performance cycling team in Loughborough University. So that was my trip over the last decade or so. And I think anyone who follows pro cycling will know that Dimension Data had a pretty rough time last year, and there was a saving grace at the end of the season with this guy, Ben King, took 2 stage wins in the Vuelta, stage 4 and stage 9. We're definitely going to look at that a little bit. And my observations from the Vuelta and some of the surprises I saw in the data is really the focus of this talk, and we dabble a little bit in the World Champs, but yeah, I think we should celebrate what Ben achieved and talk about that rather than some of the negative points of being in the World Tour. And if you find me in the pub afterwards, we can discuss that then. Let's focus on the positives. So when you're going to a Grand Tour, and particularly one that's held in Spain at the end of August, you're going to look at what riders are going to be competing in. Typically, that's going to be heat. And last year, the Vuelta started in southern Spain. You've got August in southern Spain. It was hot. It was really hot. And you've got many challenges there from many different riders. Some of the riders raced in the Vuelta Burgos, which was 2 weeks before that. It's in northern Spain, so they had a little bit of exposure to that environment, but it was only mid-20s. It wasn't super hot there. So they weren't specifically prepared for the Vuelta based off Burgos. And of course, you'll recognise, if you follow pro cycling quite widely, that many riders go to altitude. And particularly in the lead up to a Grand Tour, they like to go up there several weeks and do their altitude training. And that's a challenge in itself, but also altitude presents another problem, is that's typically cold when you're staying at 2,500 meters on a mountain. So how do you prepare going from somewhere that is high and cold to somewhere that is exceptionally hot? And how do you specifically prepare for those races? And that's a lot of what we're going to go into. And here's some of the factors influencing heat strain. And yeah, we looked at temperature, humidity, direct sunlight. There's a big radiant load in Spain, and getting the sun cream on and not getting burned, that's a challenge. Especially that we all saw like Chris Froome's pictures where he's sunburnt his back. You've got to be aware of the practical side of some of the clothing and kit choices. We can look at pre-calling a little bit. It's kind of more relevant in time trials. We certainly did some stuff in the prologue, a short few kilometers. They get women's tights or men's tights if you're that way inclined, and fill them with ice, get them around the necks, fanning on the riders, in the shade, kind of those real practical things. How do you keep bottles cold when you're driving for 5 hours through Spain? And yeah, those practical challenges are there, and a lot of performance science in pro cycling actually is just doing basic things well and understanding that the cutting edge stuff is that 1% at the top. There is so much that comes beneath that that's kind of the mundane kind of getting ice in the morning and ringing the hotel and having ice baths ready afterwards. Where do you get that ice from? Keeping it cold, that kind of thing. Hydration status, we're definitely going to come back to that. That's a big part here. How do you stay hydrated? What levels of dehydration are impairing performance, or what can we do? How can we manipulate hydration? Can it be actually beneficial? And this is the first bit of data from professional cyclists, and this was collected before I went to Aspetar by my supervisor. And this is in the Danish national team. It's a really cool study. It's a scientific study, but it's done in the field and not just on ergometers in the lab. This is done actually on the roads. They do a time trial in Denmark, in the call, that top blue line, pretty normal profile. They fly to Qatar, match exactly the same course as well as you can. It's obviously different roads, but it was flat, there weren't many corners, it was matched as well as possible. And look at the huge decrement. When they arrive in Qatar, they have 1 or 2 days to recover from the flight, and off they go. And it's a massive drop in performance. It's absolutely astronomical. After 1 week, that orange line, they're kind of halfway between the two or so. It's an improvement, but it's still some way off what they do in the call. And after 2 weeks, you've got that green line, and it's almost there. You've taken what is essentially at the beginning a huge decrement in performance, and exposing riders 2 weeks in the heat has almost obliterated that, and they nearly match what they can do in cool environments. And if you're interested, that is some of the physiology that is explaining it. And what I want to dwell on in this slide is the timing. Because you can see after just 4 or 5 days of heat acclimation, that's not very much of an intervention. You're getting this huge surge, and it's almost fully complete after 1 week. And after 2 weeks, most of those are flat lines. Some of them are actually dropping. So we think within 2 weeks, you're almost fully acclimatized to the heat, and you're ready to go. And that is exactly what Ben did. He lived in Lucca, in Tuscany. And as it happened, the environment in Lucca was incredibly similar. It almost matched what they were going to face in southern Spain, in Malaga, for the start of the Vuelta. And as David said about the training, the high intensity, low intensity, we get 20% of that high intensity work in the morning. It's not so hot, he can do that high quality work, sprint training, the high intensity intervals. And then we deliberately plan those longer duration, at 80% in zone 1. So he's riding through the hottest part of the day, and he's naturally acclimatizing to that environment over time. And I just wanted to show this slide, because you might get the impression that professional cycling is cutting edge, and there's unlimited equipment and unlimited budgets to do amazing work. And it certainly wasn't the reality. this is in Lucca in the service course. This was a £50 gazebo that I got off Amazon. I stuck a load of electric fan heaters in there and built my own heat chamber in the service course so we could do some kind of controlled testing. You can see this is what we did, and modelled by myself there, piloting the protocol. You can't really see it there. It's about 38 degrees in that room, so we got it pretty hot. That's the electric fan heaters. I originally had 3 of those, and I turned it on for the first time, and it blew all of the fuses in the service course. I wasn't the most popular that day. I think it says a lot about the Italian build quality in that room. It couldn't handle anything. I kept popping it, actually. And then you get a pro, Ben, riding on the bike. We set him up. It was a constant load test for 1 hour, ride at a set power, and really to measure sweat rate. And actually, it's an education tool. It's a chance to go with the rider and teach them that you're going to sweat this much. You need to keep drinking. Look at sweat compositions. And he really bought into that. And it was really valuable to him to understand what was going on and a chance to talk to him. I'd absolutely love to tell you this is a pre and post graph. Right, this is, I mean, the scientists in the room will crucify me for this. It's an awful figure to present to scientists. But you've got heart rate data and time ends at 1 hour. Well, it does for one of those curves. The orange line is me, and this is Ben is the blue line, and we're doing exactly the same task. About 70% of threshold power, we both ride for 1 hour in that heat tent and measure what happens. My heart rate never plateaus, it never reaches a steady state, and at about 40 minutes in, I'm at 200 beats, that's my max heart rate. I have to get off the bike, go outside, and I washed myself under the bike washer. I couldn't even stand upright, it was horrific. Look at Ben. It goes up to its steady state, and there is virtually no change in heart rate for 1 hour. Exactly the same relative intensity, we're doing the same task for ourselves. And you see that his tolerance to that sort of heat load is incredible. It hardly changes at all. He's absolutely got the thermophysiology and the adaptations that you see with heat acclimation. I mean, that's pretty impressive, that there is no heart rate drift whatsoever. And he finished, he was absolutely fine. So we go to the Vuelta, and I think a lot of this talk, we're going to look at hydration and dehydration, and some of the simplest tools you can use, particularly this one on the left, and we all recognise that, it's weighing yourself, and that's a pretty powerful tool, and you can weigh yourself every day in the morning, same time of day, track it over time, what do the changes look like. This device here is measuring urine, and it's looking at every day, provide a urine sample as you wake up, measure the urine-specific gravity. Essentially, the higher that number, the more dehydrated you are, the lower that number, the less dehydrated you are, more hydrated you are. And we provide this sort of daily feedback to the riders. And this is like a typical curve. It's many of the riders look like this, and it's the ongoing feedback. You're heavier today, you're lighter today, more hydrated, more dehydrated. You can come up with individual zones, so you want to know what is normal for a rider. Are they in that normal zone, or are they out that normal zone, and do they need to act on it? And that kind of, at the bottom, that message is pretty basic, and but it's quite useful. And being lighter is clearly an issue. If you're lighter and more dehydrated, you need to drink more. If you're lighter and more hydrated, you need to eat more. You're probably glycogen depleted. You haven't stocked up from yesterday. Being heavier is rarely a problem. And in fact, if you find a rider who's heavier and more hydrated, a strong espresso and a trip to the gents will usually tell you what was wrong there. It becomes pretty evident, and the rider will tell you that. I've broken it. And if you measure the body masses pre and post each day, you come up with this sort of curve. And I think this is what struck me the most from all the data I looked at from the races and the hydration stuff. And that's pretty remarkable, actually. In that from pre to post race, you're seeing values ranging from kind of 2% up to 6%. And this is not even the most extreme example. That change in body mass pre to post. Some riders were going 5 to 7% every single day. And this is not an exact science, and it can't be. We can't measure what they're eating, everything that they're drinking, if they're going to toilet breaks. Certainly, I hope none of the physiologists on Tom Dumoulin's team measured that. I really hope that that was left in the field where it went. So it's not an exact science. But, I mean, that's quite astonishing, those kind of big reductions in body mass. So let's look at it. There's two ways, there's two kind of questions there. Is it detrimental to performance, or is it beneficial to performance? Look at watts per kilo, that kind of thing. So what does the science say? And this is a huge risk, because I think some of the authors of this paper are in the room. So I will be deleting it for the Q&A, trying to present this to you. But this was a really cool study done on this campus by researchers here. And they concluded from this test that 3% body mass, whether they knew they were hydrated or not. And it's a super cool study. They fed gastric tubes into the nose, down into the stomach, and fed them either fluid or less fluid. So you had no idea whether you were hydrated or dehydrated or what level you were at. And irrelevant of that, whether you knew you were drinking or not, you still find this impairment in performance with a 2-hour preload and a 15-minute time trial afterwards. And you see this decrement in performance anyway, regardless of whether they knew it or not. And that's quite different to, well, it's not different to what we saw. And that 5 to 7% is not evidence. We didn't test anything. There was no hypothesis. If they'd been at 2%, would they have performed better at the end of those stages? We don't know that, but it's an interesting observation. And the science kind of, you can quite readily find anything beyond 2% is detrimental to performance. And we hardly ever saw that, even on their rest days, where they were going out and riding for a little bit, and on the pre-race rides, they were coming back at 2% dehydrated from an easy ride in the sun. And again, I think, I'll come back to this, we've already gone through it, but a lot of the research is actually done in people like me, people like that orange line, who after 40 minutes are reaching max heart rate and can't continue. Pro cyclists are freaks. They can do this kind of virtually indestructible in the heat. They can ride and tolerate those heat loads incredibly well. So does the data actually really capture those guys? We don't really know. And this brings me on to what we were doing at the World Championships in Doha. And this little pill here is a core temperature pill. And it's got a little data logger inside. And the riders, we give it to the riders, go to the hotel lobbies. Believe me, we've got some looks delivering these in hotel lobbies to pro cyclists in the World Champs in little plastic bags. But it's a very cool device, and it goes through the stomach, it goes through the intestine, it sits somewhere in the intestine for the race. Afterwards, this was my 15 minutes of fame. My hand made it into L'Equipe, the newspaper, taking Tom Dumoulin's core temperature after his time trial. And we downloaded all this data and we plotted it with heart rates and power and whatnot. And some of what came out of that, and I shared this with Peter the other day, and I think he still can't quite believe some of the numbers we reported. And look at that, core temperature at 41.5 degrees. You could still win a medal at the World Championships. That was in the team time trial in the women at 41.5 degrees. And if you present at hospital at 41.5 degrees, you're in trouble. You're seriously in trouble. And there are limitations of what we can do in the lab. You would never get ethics approval to take someone up to 41.5 degrees. We can't research that. You certainly can't research that when they're at 7% body mass dehydration of 41.5 degrees. But actually our elite endurance athletes are doing that. They're hitting these core temperatures, and they're not just hitting them, they're winning medals at the highest level of the sport at these core temperatures. So that's pretty remarkable. And again, it adds, it's not evidence, but can they tolerate this much higher level of thermal load? Do we really understand their physiology? And this is not published yet. It's currently in review, this data, but of the 1,000 riders who went to Doha and registered for the events, just 3 of them were assessed for heat exhaustion in the medical tent at the finish line. We were based there taking all the medical data. There were traumas, obviously, there were crashes, but 3 riders were assessed for heat, and none of them went to hospital. It somewhat differs from what you may have read in the media. Let's shorten the race, let's add in feed stops, it was too hot to race. These headlines were pretty much everywhere, and this picture was widely circulated. And actually, when we spoke to the team manager after this race, he said, yeah, but She looks like that every year. You know, and whether it's hot or cold or whatever, it's a team time trial at the World Championships. That is the reality of it. So putting that together and that constant dehydration and those big reductions in body mass and not being hospitalised with heat illness and high core temperatures, do we really understand what's going on there? And do we capture that with the data we have in the labs and in sports science? It probably tolerate pretty high levels. So if it's not detrimental, and it may well be, it's not evidence again, it's an observation, is it actually beneficial? Is this actually a strategy we can use to enhance performance? If we can go to 4% body mass, 5% body mass reductions, I mean, that's 2 or 3 kilos in some riders. If anyone here's tried losing 2 or 3 kilos to go up hills quicker, that's pretty hard. But you could just dehydrate and do it on race day. And we can run through some of the equations that govern that and figure out how much quicker can you go. And power required is explained kind of by these aerodynamic drag, rolling resistance, gravity. And that pretty simple equation at the bottom. Now, so you've got notes, so write it down, because there's a quiz. So get that one in. Now, many people in this room will tell you that aero is everything. It's not. So sorry. We're going to ignore aerodynamics and rolling resistance. You are wrong tonight. It's all about gravity and the effect of gravity on the power required. And that's defined by a much simpler equation. If we think back to our GCSE physics days, 9.8067 sounds a lot like the force of gravity. That's a constant. We kind of recognise that. This middle bit, that G is looking simply at the gradient. And we all know the steeper the gradient, it gets harder, and the lower the gradient, it's easier. And gradient clearly matters, but we can't change that. We can go on Strava and look at what the gradient is and make predictions about climbing speeds and whatnot, but that's also a constant for us. We can't change the gradient. W is weight, and we can change the weight. We've seen we can change the weight. We can dehydrate by 4%. So let's do it. This is stage 9, the stage banking 1, and he goes on the attack right from the start, and they ride tempo over all these climbs, and he's dehydrating, and everything's going well. He attacks from the group at about 70 kilometers to go, and he holds, and he's on his own, and he's being chased by Balcom Oliver for the stage win. It's about a minute and a half in front at the bottom of that final climb. The peloton's about 8 minutes behind. They're gone. The GC race is on back there, but we don't care about that. Ben's in the lead, and can he win it? He's got a minute and a half. 9.2K at 7.2%. Is he going to hold on? Let's do some maths. This is his weight at the start of the day, 69.8. His power, and we look at the power-speed relationship. When you're dehydrated, this is using that gradient. We're assuming a constant gradient. It's not perfect. There's many assumptions there, but if you plug in these numbers to the equations, and there's plenty of free online tools, you can do it in Excel if you like. And you see how the orange line is always slightly below that blue line. It is easier to go up that hill lighter than heavier, and that's obvious. We all know that, and that is a relationship, and it changes with speed. But that is fundamental physics of it, right? So let's do the maths. On that climb at 7.2%, and I made a load of assumptions about wind and its steady state and the tyre rolling resistance, etc. They're all assumed. But we know what power he did because we have the file. And actually, if you're interested, Ben published his file on Training Peaks. If you search for Stage 9 Training Peaks blog Ben King, you can download the Garmin file and have a look at this for yourselves. It's all there. At 69.8 kilos, he does 29.36 on the climb. That's his starting weight. If we drop 4% dehydration, and we plug those numbers in and run through the equation, we get to 28.49. It makes 47 seconds of difference, that 4%. And if that's not compromising power output, 47 seconds, that's huge. That's gonna win him the race. Well, unfortunately it doesn't, because he rides at 28.46, and second place is at 48 seconds. So ignore that, because he'd have won anyway. Don't worry about it. I was pretty annoyed when that came out, actually. But that raises, for me, more questions. Is it detrimental? Is it beneficial? Oh, we don't really know. But actually, is it sustainable? if it's not detrimental in the first week of the race, in those first 5 to 7 days, is that same level of dehydration after 20 days when we went to Andorra right at the end of the race? Can you still tolerate that level? Is it still detrimental? Is it more detrimental then? Is it less beneficial? We can look at it in isolation in 1 day, but what happens after 3 weeks? We don't know. And think of the stress on the body. Of the hydration advice and rehydration advice is something like 125 to 150% of what you lost in fluids, what you need to rehydrate. If you've lost 3 to 4 kilos and you finish a Grand Tour stage at 5 or 6 p.m. and you've got to travel 2 hours and you've got to get a massage and you've got to eat, you've also got to drink 4 to 5 litres of fluid before bed every single day for a month. And that's a challenge in itself. So is it sustainable? But actually the bigger question for me is, isn't it just inevitable? We were telling him to drink as much as you can. Keep drinking, keep eating, because you can't replace what you're losing. And whatever you do, you're going to lose body mass reduction. So you can call this permissive dehydration a strategy, but doesn't it just happen anyway? And it's an open question. What can we do about it? If you're drinking and eating as much as you can, how can we limit body mass losses to less than that? I don't know. It's an open question, that one. Finally, it's a little plug from me and many of the riders for the squatter in the team. This is the new project, is launching a high-performance cycling team out of the university. And this is what we have. I think it's pretty impressive to start with. This is the lowest point. This is what we begin with, and we obviously have big aspirations going forwards. But we're setting up as a high-performance team with nutrition, with S&C, with student coaches, physiologists, nutrition, and everything. And we're very, very lucky to have Richard Ferguson supporting the team in sports science and developing everything that we're doing, keeping in line with the school and with the science, and doing science that is actually directly contributing to how we train and how we race. And also with the aeronautical and automotive engineering, we've got Dr. Duncan Walker. I don't know if he's in the room tonight, but he's contributing and helping us with aerodynamic support and using the engineering department on campus. So we're very fortunate in we have an extremely capable campus and some incredible individuals who are helping us along this route to contribute to cycling here. Please follow us. Please find us, give us a follow, give us a like, and keep up with what we're doing. Thank you.
Well, folks, it's been a fascinating evening. It's now 9:10. I really would like to run a short Q&A panel session, if I may, but I'm going to cut that absolutely dead at 9:30, the very latest. If people do need to leave, then please feel that you can. But I think it's been such an interesting evening to date. We've heard so many different perspectives. It'd be a shame if we didn't have at least a brief opportunity for a Q&A. So if I can invite the 4 speakers to come grab a chair at the front here, I'll do my very best to chair any questions from the floor. But before I open it up, I'd like to make an observation, which is, I think what I've heard tonight is that we know more than ever about how training impacts on physiology, how training can be more systematic, more informed. But I think I've also heard there is still an awful lot we don't understand about the absolute limits of human performance in a sport like cycling. And I actually take some comfort from that, because it keeps it interesting. It keeps, I guess, more questions to be answered for many of us here tonight, but also the fact that there's still an awful lot that determines outcome that we've yet to fully understand. So with that thought in mind, I'd love to open it for questions. I think it'd be great if you raise your hand and I call you. Please tell us a little about who you are and what you do. So who would like to go first? Could be an earlier night in the pub, please.
Yeah, I'm Simon on the exercise physiology master's students. And this question is to Dr. Nichols. I noticed in the previous slide that we actually didn't have a psychologist listed. But part of what I'm kind of getting at is you mentioned at the start you're a sports science coach on the Dimension
scientific advice and read the papers, but actually do they tell you so much about how these guys respond? It's pretty difficult. But yeah, I think with soft skills and getting to know riders and building a relationship with those riders is a challenge. It's almost more important than anything. It's getting that trust and that buy-in from the riders. Absolutely, it's crucial. Can't be done without.
Yes.
Jamie Pringle with Bolton Performance Centre. Dave Bishop, question going right back to the start of your presentation. You talked about a lot of things around training prescription. I'm sure a lot of the coaches in the room here will be taking notes about the sort of structure of training and how to divide and weed up that divide and up. I was particularly struck by your talk about some of the data around training twice a day versus training once every other day, and equalising the total training volume but getting more bang for your buck by the way you're splitting it into twice per day. That's incredibly practical, and it sounds incredibly realistic, and it's not that particularly hard to achieve, and I'm sure quite a lot of people will be appealed by that as well. Can you tell us a bit more what you think about the ordering of that effect and the timing between those sessions, and high intensity first or low intensity first?
Yeah. So you've done the one study there. I don't know how practical it is in the way that we did it. So it was 3 weeks. And so doing the twice a day, 3 times a week was pretty tough. I'm not sure we could have done that for more than 3 weeks, that actual study. So that, for the participants, it was pretty tough. But, so I think it's probably something you could introduce every now and again. The question was the timing. I think. So you're talking about which to go first. We had a combination, so didn't go through all the details. So what they did for the glycogen depleting exercise was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was like 90 minutes of sort of, moderate intensity exercise, and then we also did some sprints to try and to deplete the glycogen from the fast twitch fibers. So we didn't specifically look at that, but I think and then I think the other key thing that wasn't in there is that we didn't feed them for the 3 hours before they then did the next session. So there's always lots of stuff going in there. So I'm getting jet lag.
Needs some fuel.
I need some sleep. So I mean, when you do exercise, what you're also, it's almost you're depleting the nutrients from the cell, and that becomes the stimulus. So what I think part of that is what's happening is you're doing that first exercise stimulus. You're decreasing some of the fuel inside your muscle, and that's starting the stimulus process. So you think about the graph, and you've got the increase in the stimulus, and then while you're up there, you're kind of hitting it again. So you're getting the second effect superimposed on the first effect. So we've got some follow-up studies there. So I think there's two elements there. One is having the 2 exercises reasonably close together, but I also think probably not having the refueling in between is an equally important part to kind of optimise their stimulus. And we were talking about that before. It's interesting because in some respects it also goes counter to what is the common advice. Trying to refuel as quickly as possible as soon as you finish your session and get the carbohydrates and get the proteins into you, etc. So I think there's probably an argument for, in terms of adaptation, that may not actually be the best approach.
Sam Braddock, Paralympian, trying to go from track and field into track cycling. I hate keto training. Dr. Nichols, I love the fact that you plug Loughborough. That's amazing. I love that. I graduated in 2012. You made it out of the bubble. I'm still here. My honest question is, after everything you've achieved on the world touring circuit, I think I know the answer. But what made you want to come back?
I think it's an unbelievable opportunity to launch a team here out of this campus and to share that vision of creating something from essentially cycling is more a student-oriented sport. I mean, can we actually create a pathway where you can go to university and you can become a cyclist? And can they come together and be that solution to what is essentially lacking in cycling that you see in triathlon, athletics and swimming? And I think that if we get that right, and hopefully we will, it will be quite a remarkable thing that we've done. Yeah, that's the goal, that's the vision.
I'm a cyclist. General question really. Does the Pro Peloton, thinking about that presentation, does the Pro Peloton rubber stamp science, or does it continually surprise the scientists?
I think it does both. I think I'm very adamant. Being in pro cycling is not taking science and putting it into pro cycling. It goes both ways. We've got to inform training. We've got to do something to come up with training tools and analyse data and look at it. What can we learn from pro cycling as well? And I think a lot of what people view at the moment is that sports scientists come in and tell cycling what to do, and the lab studies inform it. But actually, it needs to go both ways. It has to. We have to learn from what professional cyclists are doing, and that also has to inform the science and inform what we do with the science. So yeah, absolutely, I think it goes both ways.
Sorry.
Frankly, I'm one of the performance cyclists in the student. An open question with regards to the bike path. So I take it before like a track pursuit race, which is 3 to 4 minutes. Is there any benefit to training with it as well as just racing with it? And what's like a duration period? Would it be beneficial for a 20-minute race as it is for a 3 to 4 minute race?
Yes, I mean, a lot of people do it for the performance stuff, so you're probably hitting the nail on the head around about probably 1 to 4, 5, 6 minutes. Outside of that, you're probably not going to get any performance benefit. You have to be, as like everything, I guess, a little bit careful. I know, I'm sure, I don't know how, if you have only like one race a day or if you have any, there's a
It would be for, one race.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, because some events, depending on it, when I was working with kayaking, for example, you could have a semi-final in the morning and then you have a final in the afternoon. And so I know some people, some of the athletes would find that if you took the bicarbonate for the semi-final, you'd have an awesome semi-final. But because it was allowing you to go a little bit probably harder than what you'd normally be able to go, then they wouldn't be able to back up in the final. So I think you need to be careful there if you're doing if you're doing more than one race in a day. If you've got a competition that involves heats or semis or whatever, you need to be a little bit careful. It's pretty hard to overdose on bicarbonate just because it will make you really sick. But there was so I think just as a caution, because normally like you say, okay, take this amount, someone will say, okay, maybe I'll take double or triple and then it'll be even better. But there was a couple of years ago in Italy where there was a swimmer, I think they had some sort of competition to see who could have the most bicarbonate, and someone put themselves in hospital in that sort of scenario. So it's really hard to do, and you have to be really, really, really stupid to do that. But it is possible to make yourself really sick, so be careful there. The second part, so I think you're talking about the competition. Training, it's some of the lab stuff with moderately trained people, we've been able to see an effect. I have heard, I've never done anything with the lead athletes, but I have heard of some people trying it. So I think it's something that's worth trying. I think it's like everything, you need to probably titrate it. So try it a little bit and start with a low dose. You can, probably the first couple of times you do it, it's maybe better to do it on an indoor trainer rather than outdoor, because you can very quickly need to go to the toilet for either for throwing up or for some action at the other end. So you probably don't want to be halfway through a 100k ride when that happens. So it's something you need to experiment with. But I think, yeah, at least in the lab and like when we've done, I think there is some argument that it could give a benefit in that. So when we do it, it's not actually people training harder. They're doing exactly the same training session. So getting the same mechanical stimulus, doing exactly the same power output, but by minimising the physiological disturbance in the muscle, there seems to be the potential to get a slightly better gain from the training. So I think it's worth trying.
Here I will across the stick. My name is Arthur Rossi. I'm a PhD student at the University of Kent. And my question is for you, David, but feel free the others to answer as well. You kind of suggest that the polarized training should be the best way to go according to the biomolecular adaptations. But there is some evidence that should suggesting that cyclists don't actually train like that. They train more based on threshold intensities. So do you think that there could be a scope for a higher, the need for a higher intensity at the highest levels, the same way that they are more used to higher core temperatures? They may need higher intensities as well to stimulate the EGC1 alpha and the other molecular pathways.
Yeah, I'll start on that. I mean, I think I was trying to look at some of that data, so it'd be interesting to see, and I think some of it comes back to maybe what Richard was talking about as well, as in how you actually define some of the thresholds, because you see some of these elite athletes and their threshold is higher than what people's maxes actually is, and so maybe we did some work with some triathletes, and they were sitting at 350 watts for hours, so that was around about their threshold. So it'd be interesting to see whether exactly how those zones are being determined. Even if they're doing a really high power output, maybe they are actually in zone 1 despite the power outputs. So and I don't see. I think rowing, a lot of those sports are rowing, swimming, running, seems to be that polarized model seems to work well. Whether cycling mechanically is a little bit different, so whether a slightly different training distribution might work better with that, I don't actually know.
There's a question here.
Question for Ian. The first paper you showed, the Burnley and Jones paper, and you pulled out the quote about motivation. I think the justification for that was a paper where there was a single leg extensor exercise and showed that participants weren't able to sustain a given, weren't able to output a certain force, even though there was no change in EMG signal. So how does that square with your feelings on motivation?
Yeah, I mean, I put that back. Like, I appreciate that those authors, it was probably a throwaway comment to some degree. Part of the problem is for that. So again, what I think what you're describing there, the motivational dose is small. It's tiny. So I'm presuming that there's no increases. But what's their dose of motivation? Where's the manipulation of motivation? It's a very small. Trying really hard is not really that big a dose of motivation, is that? So I think that's in those sorts of experiments, there is unlikely to be any changes because you're talking about minute doses of motivation. Really do your best this time versus do your best. It's not an increase in motivation. Is that? Yeah.
So you're saying that the motivational drive to sustain that exercise under experimental conditions isn't necessarily big enough to overcome the physiology.
Yeah, that's what I would argue to some degree. And I also would say, things like that max, sort of 1 rep maxes and stuff like that. The motivational implications for 1 rep there's not really a desire, that much of a desire. Although you're talking about sort of keeping it at sort of stages, yeah. So I just think that the experiments are not set up to test motivation. So don't conclude that motivation is not important. And also there's little things like in the statement, in healthy motivated athletes, no amount of motivation helps. Well, if you're full of glycogen doesn't help either, or whatever, do you know what I mean? So the ceiling effects and things like that. So I think the broad thing is, I don't think you can make conclusions on motivation when you're not studying those processes.
Sorry to just delve into psychology, but we did a study a while back where we had people doing time to fatigue, and we manipulated the clock without them knowing anything about it, so the clock going faster or slower, kind of counter to our hypothesis. When we had the fast clock, we found that when we converted back to the real time, they went longer, and what we think as our amateur psychologists, but was the motivation, because what was happening is that they were getting to what they thought was 2 minutes, but it was 1 minute, and they go, wow, I feel like I normally feel a minute 30. So they kind of gave them the motivation, like I'm having a really good day, I can actually, and they ended up going, so on the fast clock, they ended up going on the real time a lot faster. So I think and that was an actual time to fatigue, critical power type trial, a couple of minutes to fatigue there. So I think, in that instance, they didn't know it, but I think manipulating the motivation did allow them to go beyond what their normal physiological limit was.
I think perceptions can be shifted easily. Yeah, and so if you can do that, then the next thing is how to do it systematically. Yeah.
Folks, I really think I'll have to close it now at 9:30. Please ask you to join me in thanking our 4 presenters for a fascinating evening and brilliant insights. Just like to conclude by making an observation. I think ending at the point where we've got psychologists and physiologists talking together, possibly agreeing there are still things we don't understand.